Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Today we are going to move on, tragically enough, from the Greek world. Those are such sad words to say. Um, but we are going to move on to something that is also a very glorious page in the history of the West, and that, of course, is ancient Rome. Now, our last thinker that we explored in terms of his educational philosophy was Aristotle. And he is actually a perfect person in some ways to lead us into this segue into the period that comes after the classical period of ancient Greece. You recall that ancient Greek history is divided by modern historians into three distinct periods. That would be the Archaic period, which stretches from, say, the 8th century BC to the year 490 BC, or perhaps 479 BC. At which point the classical period then takes over, and the classical period stretches from, let's say, 479 BC until 323 BC, and then from 323 BC until 31 BC gives us what is known as the Hellenistic period. The Archaic period, as we've discussed, is sort of the period when ancient Greece was sort of getting its act together. The polis system was emerging as the dominant political structure organism inside of the Greek world. The poetry of Homer and Hesiod was written down. The religious shrines of Delphi and Olympia were emerging as the kind of cultural focal points of the Greek world. And then the Archaic period sort of climaxes with the Persian Wars, when Persia invaded ancient Greece, and ancient Greece rebuffed it, drove it out, defeated it on Greece's own soil. And this sort of, especially in Athens, gave rise to a period of the greatest creativity and cultural flourishing that the ancient Greek world had ever seen, ever would see. And this is the period of Periclean Athens, when tragedy and comedy reach their highest level of development, where philosophy really begins. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all are active during this period of the classical period. History begins to be written by Herodotus and Thucydides, and of course the art of rhetoric, persuasion and speech, and therefore the training for that sort of education, for that sort of capacity, affects and molds and infuses and vivifies the educational apparatus of the ancient Greek world, where sophists and others who are trained in the art of persuasion go around and train young people into this art. And it is particularly that capacity of rhetoric, of persuasion and speech, and the ability to win over audiences, influence politics, present one's case before a law court, that really becomes kind of one of the major sort of educational features that will go on to kind of mark the education of ancient Greece in the centuries going forward. Of course, ancient Greek education had always been dual in its outlook. There always was a physical aspect of it, with athletics and physical beauty, calisthenics in the true sense of that word. And then also the musicae, or the musical aspect of it, really anything that we would call under kind of the liberal arts, literature, poetry, music in our limited sense of the word also. Now, but of course, philosophy began to be a big part of the intellectual inheritance of the ancient Greek world during the classical period. And as we saw, so much of what was sort of implicit in previous centuries of Hellenism became explicit with Aristotle. Now, as I said in my opening salvo to this talk, Aristotle is sort of the perfect person for as he stands basically on the doorway into the next period of time. And that is because his most famous student was none other than Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, a Macedonian prince and ultimately king, who we will talk more about this in subsequent lectures, but suffice it to say for now, he took his army, and this kind of combined Greco-Macedonian army, and invaded the Persian Empire. He went east and romped around the Near East for the next decade or so, steeping himself in military glory, but also establishing Greek-like cities all over the place in the formerly totally unknown world. Places as far afield as Egypt, all throughout Asia Minor, and Syria, what is modern-day Lebanon, Israel, but then even further into Afghanistan and Pakistan, even into the very western borders of India. In fact, if you can believe it, the Afghan city of Kandahar, that we've, of course, have heard so much about over the past few months, is actually a corrupted version of the name Alexandros, of Alexander. And he would name cities, as I said, after himself all over the place. And the most famous of which, of course, is Alexandria in Egypt. And the culture that emerges in the next several centuries as Greek culture mixes with indigenous native Near Eastern cultures that are very, very different than Greek culture. This sort of merger of these two things, of Egyptian and Greek, even Hebrew and Greek, and these other cultures in the Indus Valley and so on, all the way throughout that entire region, though that became known as Hellenistic. Okay, Hellenistic. The word itself is a coinage of the modern age. It was actually invented by a German historian of the 19th century named Heinrich Droysen, who wanted to distinguish the Greek culture as he saw it, that obtained in the wake of the classical period, outside of the bounds of the old Greek world. He wanted to distinguish that new type of culture from what had come before it. And so the word Hellenistic, as it were, bears the same resemblance to the word Hellenic, which means Greek, as the words real does to the word realistic. Okay, so Hellenic culture in this surmise is the Greek culture of the classical period. That's real Greek culture. And then the Hellenistic culture that obtains in the Near East for these centuries during this period after Alexander, that is kind of Greekish. It's Hellenistic. Okay, it has the same relationship as realistic to real. And of course, there's kind of a put down there. That was Droysen's characterization of the Hellenistic world, was sort of, in the negative estimation, is sort of characteristic of his time. More modern, more recent, I should say, historians have had a more positive view on the achievements of the Hellenistic world. But what is most important for us is that during this Hellenistic period, a lot of the things that were sort of latent and kind of nascent in their formation of education now become sort of codified. Okay, so a lot of the educational things that were going on in the classical period, where different sophists were kind of, experimenting with the use of language, the teaching of language and teaching of persuasive speech and stuff such as we saw with the sophists, and even with the theorization of Plato and Aristotle. Now all of that becomes to be kind of codified in written books of kind of rule books of how to speak properly, how to write properly, the canons of rhetoric. Okay, and there begins to be a lot of kind of formulation. I don't want to make it sound like it's this sort of lifeless, just sort of paint by numbers kind of thing, but there begins to be much more of like a scientific way of looking at it, like as opposed to just being more free flowing and maybe organic. Now it becomes much more kind of like, okay, so you have to have these 5 parts to an oration. There are, there are these 6 canons of oratory, different parts of the oratorical arts, and you have to kind of work on each one of them and so on. And we don't have these books anymore in their original Greek, but what we do have are treatises, and in some cases even books about them, written by the greatest individual who flowered in the world of oratory and rhetoric, that inherited the Hellenistic culture, and that, of course, is the Roman author Cicero. Okay, Marcus Tullius Cicero, because the the Romans, this entire time, while the Greeks during the Hellenistic period are off doing their, fighting amongst each other and kind of working out something like a balance of powers in the Eastern Mediterranean, the very energetic Romans in the West were not being idle at all. And in fact, they were essentially, it took several centuries. Rome traditionally is founded in the 8th century BC, but whatever the case of that may be, it was certainly active during the 5th, 6th, and the 5th and then 4th, and then going centuries in the West, conquering the different areas of all throughout the Italian peninsula, Sicily, Spain, and the very small part of southern France that it extended into at that time, and particularly the northern African civilization of Carthage, okay, that it ultimately would defeat in the year 202 BC at the end of the Great Second Punic War. Carthage would still exist as a city, though, for another 50 or 60 years or so, until the year 146, when Rome finally just wiped it off the map, literally. But after 202, that's really the pivotal year for our story now. Rome turned east. Rome, after having secured all of its conquests in the West, now began to turn its energy towards the Greek East. And so the 3rd century onwards is when Rome begins to have military interactions, sometimes peaceful interactions, sometimes diplomatic interactions, but for the most part, military and violent ones, with the Greeks of the East. And ultimately, the entire Greek world will be subsumed within the Roman Empire by the year 31. And we put that year as the end of the Hellenistic period, because 31 is the year in which the last of the Hellenistic monarchies, that is Egypt, fell to the Romans. Okay, so there's different kingdoms after Alexander the Great's death. That whole huge territory that he had conquered sort of was divvied up among about 3 main empires, 3 main kingdoms, who were all generals of his. And they all, and then there were smaller ones too, but all of those ultimately wound up being subsumed within Rome. Now, even though Rome conquered Greece militarily, Greece conquered Rome culturally. Okay, this is this phenomenon of being conquered militarily, although conquering culturally, was summed up very nicely by the famous phrase of Horace, the Roman poet, that conquered Greece has conquered her savage conqueror. That is the idea, that Rome, as the military superpower, nevertheless lacked a lot of the cultural refinement that the Greeks had in terms of art, literature, philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, all of that stuff. We will see that the Romans were basically relentlessly practical and couldn't really be any more different than the Greeks than they were. The Greeks were so theoretical and so, always pursuing knowledge wherever it might lead, simply for its own sake. Whereas the Romans were, whatever education they did have in those early centuries was, mercilessly practical. It was all about military duties, maybe a little bit of farming techniques, and that's basically it. There would be some reading and writing, but there was no literature. Okay, there was no Latin literature. That would come to be developed, but only under the influence of the Greeks. Okay, because the Greeks, of course, had a literary history stretching back centuries at this point, and a very, very rich one, the richest indeed of the entire Western world. So the Romans had to play catch up, and they began to develop their own literature and also their own kind of form of education, but only and exclusively really under the influence of the Hellenic model, of the Greek model. And we will explore that a little bit more next week when we look at Quintilian, as we look at the kind of the 3 different tiers of Roman education, the different aspects of it, the ludus, the grammaticus, the orator, or the orator. These were kind of like the elementary, middle, and high school, kind of, if you want to think of them like that, of Roman education, with philosophy sometimes being added as sort of like a college experience. We will talk all about that later on next week. But what I want to do right now is, and for the rest of our time tonight, is I want to look at and take as primary sources the writings of Cicero, because he is one of the most prolific authors of the entire Roman world, and one of its, if not, it's definitely hands down the greatest prose author of the entire Latin literature. And we're going to take a look primarily at the parts of his oeuvre in which he discusses rhetoric and education, and look at the different aspects of it, kind of to see how this Greek model of education comes to be adopted and adapted by the Romans. And because it is through this adaptation and this adoption that it will be bequeathed to subsequent ages of Western civilization. Okay, so remember, one of the major themes that we're looking at in our course is how Greek education, born in Greece in this particular time and locale, because of its very nature as an ideal, could be transferred over to other cultures, who would not empty it of its content, but would rather tweak it and adapt it to their own. And it would persist despite these radical changes of language, in this case from Greek to Latin, and also culture, the Roman culture very different than the Greek. And then even just looking forward, even in terms of religious changes, right? When the Roman world will convert to Christianity, a process that basically is completed by, say, the 6th century AD, then you will see that classical education will still be the form of education that will be utilized, but it will be quite changed. It will be adapted to the new faith, and it will take on a character really all of its own, even though it still very much is recognizable as going back to that initial Greek exemplar. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. To that end, what I'd like to do, just to kind of begin with the first maybe 10, 15 minutes or so, is just give you a little brief biography of Cicero, and so you can kind of put everything that we're going to be reading of his tonight into some kind of context. Marcus Tullius Cicero was born on January 3rd, 106 BC, in the small Italian town of Arpinum, which is approximately 70 miles southeast of Rome. And he was born to a family that, although they were not members of the Roman nobility, were prominent in the local community and had important connections in the capital city. While Marcus and his brother Quintus were still boys, the family moved to Rome, and this was a move aimed at advancing the education and prospects of the two brothers. There, the boys were brought into contact with the two leading orators of the day, Lucius Licinius Crassus and Marcus Antonius, who were later to become the two chief speakers in Cicero's greatest rhetorical treatise, one we're going to be looking at a lot tonight, a dialogue on the ideal orator named De Oratore. In such an environment, from boyhood on, Cicero was able to observe Rome's leading speakers and statesmen operating on a daily basis in the courts and in the forum. After Crassus's death in 91 BC, Cicero, at the tender age of 15 or 16, assumed what in Latin is known as the toga virilis, or the toga of manhood. He basically became a legal man at that point, a legally aged man, and was formally introduced to Quintus Mucius Scaevola, sometimes called the Augur, who was one of Rome's greatest legal experts of his time, and he is also given a prominent place as one of the speakers in De Oratore. And under his tutelage, Cicero acquired his enormous respect and knowledge of the civil law. If you study Roman history, of course, one of the first things you learn is that the Romans simply loved the law. This is one of the greatest inheritances that they have given over to Western civilization. The young Cicero was no doubt a precocious student. In addition to his oratorical and legal studies with Crassus, Antonius, and Scaevola, he developed an interest in and abiding love for philosophy. While still a teenager, he published his first rhetorical work, De Inventione, or On Invention, which in later years he would describe as, quote, the sketchy and unsophisticated work that found its way out of my notebooks when I was a boy, or rather a youth. We'll be looking at some of that tonight too. And this work is very much on the model of those Hellenistic handbooks that I was describing earlier. And it is the best example, actually, of one, along with some other ones of Cicero's that we'll be looking at tonight, too. And through Cicero's tremendous influence, it would have a remarkable and abiding presence on the rhetorical and oratorical studies that existed in the Middle Ages on into the Renaissance. After a brief tour of military service during the war with the Italian allies, the so-called Bellum Sociorum, or social war, Cicero returned to a Rome that during the decade of the 80s BC was largely torn apart by civil strife, by bloodshed, by proscription, brought on by the conflict between the strongmen of the late Republic, Marius, Cinna, and Sulla. When some sense of order had finally been restored and the courts began to function again regularly, Cicero took up his first civil cases, to be followed in 80 BC by his first criminal case, his defense of Roscius of Ameria on a charge of parricide. Shortly after this impressive victory, he won that case. He decided to continue his education by spending about 2 years on what amounted to a sort of grand tour of Greece, where he met, interacted with, and studied among several prestigious rhetoricians, orators, and philosophers. And he returned to Rome in 77 BC, a more vigorous and refined speaker. Cicero was now nearly 30 years old, the minimum age required for standing for the office of quaestor, a sort of public treasurer or paymaster. But it was the first on the rung of what the Romans called the cursus honorum, or the race course of offices that you had to go through to, if you wanted to ascend to the highest magistracies. Well, as I mentioned earlier, his family was not numbered among the Roman nobility because none of them before him had ever become a Roman senator by virtue of being elected to public office. So the sort of Cicero, being he was one of what they called a new man, a novus homo, a person whose ancestors had never held the magistracies before. Well, Cicero found himself in a notably disadvantaged political position because election to the higher magistracies at Rome was jealously guarded by and generally restricted to members of this nobility of rank, the white shoe boys, the in crowd. And Cicero, actually, one of the marks of his whole life would actually be a sort of abiding self-consciousness about this fact that he was not really part of that club, and he really, really wanted to be part of it. Well, nonetheless, he managed to win for himself the election, finishing first on the ballot, and in the first eligible year, suo anno, he won in his own year, and served as quaestor in Sicily. The connections he forged there accrued to his benefit 5 years later, when the Sicilians, recalling his good and upright service, enlisted him to prosecute one Gaius Verres, the corrupt governor of the island of Sicily, who had served there from 73 to 70. And the locals wanted to bring him up on a charge of extortion. You see, he had basically bled the provincials dry. Well, Cicero's stunning success in that case, against the power of the senatorial order and one Hortensius, the most famous advocate of the day, who was defending Verres, catapulted Cicero into the limelight as Rome's leading orator and advocate. Other political offices duly followed for Cicero: aedile, praetor, and finally the consulship, the highest magistracy in Republican Rome. And of course, he won them all, as he never stops talking about in his writings. He won them all in the minimum age requirement for each one. There's a higher age requirement for each office, and he won them all suo anno, in his year. During the final months of Cicero's year as consul, this was 63 BC, Cicero uncovered a plot to overthrow the government, led by a revolutionary, a kind of bankrupt senator of noble descent who had just basically wasted all of his patrimony, one Lucius Sergius Catilina, or as it's anglicized, Catiline. Through his diligence, though, Cicero, through the assistance of informants and his own inspiring oratory, students of Latin will all read the justly famous Catilinarian orations. Cicero managed to thwart the coup, and with the threat still imminent, to gain approval by the Senate over the objections of some, to execute the conspirators without a trial. You see, this was against the rules. It was against the law to execute a Roman citizen without a trial, but because it was such a nasty situation, so it was basically they had declared martial law, and they gave the consul Cicero the duty to see to it that the state come to no harm. So Cicero took that as a kind of carte blanche, which it was, and he executed these brigands, or these ne'er-do-well senators or aristocrats and would-be conspirators. He had them all executed, and the story goes actually that when he came into the Senate to announce their death, he did so with a wonderful example of the third person plural perfect active indicative, vixerunt, they have lived, and that was all he said. Well, in the aftermath of this, a perfect kind of like the most wonderful moment of Cicero's career, he was given a public ovation, a thanksgiving, and was decreed pater patriae, the father of the fatherland. And in this moment of triumph, when he had seemingly managed to unite the Roman people against the threat of the coup, Cicero envisioned a concordia ordinum, or harmony of the various political classes of Rome, which he wrote about in his treatises, in his letters, in his philosophical works. But, however, only a few years later, after the coming from this dizzying height, forces would conspire to dash that dream of the Concordia Ordinum and to transform the source of Cicero's crowning glory into one of debilitating disgrace. For in 60 BC, various maneuverings and political machinations had fostered an alliance between three powerful men, Julius Caesar, the great general Pompey Magnus the Great, and the wealthy Marcus Crassus, not the orator that Cicero had studied under, but actually a distant relative of that boyhood mentor. Although initially invited to join this first triumvirate, as it's called by modern historians, Cicero ultimately could not bring himself to support it. And these three men in turn were content to give free rein to his opponents, you see, chief of whom was one of Cicero's arch enemies, the tribune Publius Clodius, who managed to force Cicero into a disgraceful exile in the year 58 because Clodius was a tribune in that year, and he passed a law that said any magistrate who at any time had ever executed any Roman citizens without a trial must be sent into exile. Well, there was only one person he was thinking of, and that was Cicero. And he was able to get that bill passed into law, and Cicero was sent into exile. He took refuge in Greece and endured a most miserable year and a half of his life, during which he suffered acute depression and even contemplated suicide. The Senate recalled him in triumph, though, in 57. However, the triumvirs still held sway in Rome and had warned Cicero, through the agency of his brother Quintus, not to pursue any policy hostile to their interests. In fact, at the behest of the triumvirs, Cicero, that is, was even forced against his will to defend several of his former enemies. And in this sort of repressive environment, Cicero turned to writing and spent the last several years of the decade of the 50s composing some of his most famous and most important, I should say, and significant literary treatises, including the one I've been talking about so much, De Oratore, on the ideal orator, and also his kind of platonically inspired De Republica, on the Republic, and De Legibus, on the laws. In 51 BC, Cicero was assigned by the Senate to serve as proconsul of the province of Cilicia in Asia Minor, which is modern-day southwestern Turkey. And there he executed his duties honorably, restoring order and even undertaking a brief but very successful military campaign against some warring hill tribes. The political situation back in Rome had been deteriorating for several years. The triumvir Crassus had been killed on military campaign in Parthia in 53, and the relationship between the remaining triumvirs, Caesar and Pompey, was fast approaching a breaking point. Only a few weeks following Cicero's return to Rome from his governorship in Cilicia, full-scale civil war broke out in January of 49. And after much hesitation and personal deliberation, and even a failed attempt to reconcile Caesar and Pompey, Cicero eventually joined the Republican forces under the command of Pompey in Greece. But following their defeat at a place called Pharsalus in Greece, Thessaly in northern Greece in 48 BC, Cicero returned to Italy, and after another stretch of agonizing uncertainty, was among those pardoned by Caesar, given clemency, and permitted to remain in the country. Others in the Republican cause, especially Cato the Younger, fought on and ultimately committed suicide. During the ensuing dictatorship of Julius Caesar, Cicero again saw his opportunities for playing a significant role in the public arena greatly curtailed. And moreover, the tragic death of his beloved daughter Tullia in 45 forced him further into withdrawal and to near despair. As he had done a decade earlier in forced retirement, he turned to writing, especially philosophy, as he searched for consolation. And during this period, he composed a remarkable number of rhetorical and philosophical works, including a work that we'll look at tonight, the Brutus, the Orator, his work De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, on moral ends, as it's commonly translated, the Tusculan Disputations, and De Natura Deorum, on the nature of the gods. Now, while he was not directly involved in the assassination of Julius Caesar, he makes a point of saying this in his personal letters, Cicero definitely viewed that assassination as an opportunity for the Republic to rise again from its ashes. This, of course, is on the Ides of March in 44 BC. But the subsequent actions of Mark Antony, one of Caesar's close friends and his colleague in the consulship that year, soon led Cicero to fear that Rome had merely substituted one tyrant for another. Taking up what would be his final and perhaps most courageous cause, he managed to rally the people and the Senate of Rome through a series of speeches that he entitled the Philippics. The title is the one used by the great Greek orator Demosthenes, who had delivered his Philippics 300 years earlier against Philip II of Macedon. And they are marvelous works of vituperation and slander, basically. I mean, everything nasty you could ever say about a person, he said against Mark Antony. But in the end, Cicero's hopes of a restored republic were dashed when the young and ambitious grandnephew and heir of Julius Caesar, that is, the future Augustus, we call him Octavian at this point, but his contemporaries would have simply called him Julius Caesar. He, at this point, the tender age of, let's see, would have been about 19, maybe. Yes, his birthday was in August, so of 43, he would have still been 19. He joined forces with Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus in a second triumvirate that immediately set about eliminating their opposition to control of the state. Cicero's name appeared prominently on the list of the proscribed, you see, because even though Cicero had been instrumental in raising Octavian up as sort of a counterbalance to the unpredictable Antony, once Octavian and Antony got into cahoots with one another, the first person on their list, they kind of wrote up a list of people that they were going to have killed. The first person that Antony wanted killed was, of course, Cicero. His name appeared prominently on that list of the proscribed, and after being hunted down near the small and beautiful little town of Formiae, you can still go and visit La Tomba di Cicerone there in Italy. He was killed there, Cicero, and his head and hands were severed from his body by Antony's orders and brought back to Rome, where they were prominently displayed on the rostra, the speaker's platform, where Cicero had so often stood to address the Roman people. And we are told that Fulvia, the wife of Mark Antony, took a special delight in taking, when she saw the head and hands on the speaker's platform, because he had spoken against her too in the speeches. She took a special delight in removing the brooch pin from her kind of garment that she was wearing and plunging it into the tongue of the severed head of Cicero. Cicero's enduring legacy stems largely from his writings. In fact, we know more about Cicero than any other person from antiquity, of Greco-Roman antiquity, largely owing to the vast corpus of his works that survive today. Nearly 60 of his speeches are extant, as well as a score of philosophical and rhetorical works and almost 1,000 personal letters. These writings have been valued from his day down to our own times, of course, and they have given inspiration to every age subsequent to his own and Western civilization, from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance to the early modern period to our own day. And they provide for us the portrait of a man in all of his dimensions: the orator, the rhetorician, the politician, the philosopher, the patriot. We see his warts, we see his pettiness in his personal letters. He talks all about what was going on, then we see his fears. And the portrait that we are given of him is of a person that, for any classicist, you can't really help but sort of have a feeling of friendship for Cicero, because we know him so well. We spend so much time, we have such an insight into his words, into his soul. And he is one of the great figures of all time. Now, that is his basic, those are the general outlines of his biography. What I would like to do now is turn to his actual texts and see how they present, sort of walk you through for the next 2 hours or so, the kind of nature of rhetorical education, the different aspects of rhetoric as it came to be codified during the Hellenistic and Roman period, and ground all of that in actual in the actual texts written by Cicero himself. Let us begin with Cicero's ideas on the origins. Let us begin with Cicero's ideas of the origins of eloquent and persuasive speech. The precise nature of eloquent and persuasive speech was a topic fiercely debated in antiquity. Is rhetoric an actual art, or merely a skill, a knack? Does it require natural ability, or can it be mastered merely through the acquisition of certain techniques and the memorization of a body of rules and precepts? Generally, the ancient theorists spoke of a requisite triad, and this is something, of course, that we have seen going back to the Sophists. That triad consisted of natural ability, or inborn talent, mastery of the art of speaking, as outlined in rhetorical treatises called artes in Latin. And we might just kind of summarize that whole idea with the idea of instruction or teaching. And then lastly, diligent application of one's own talent and training through practice. So it's the same thing that the sophist Protagoras talked about, and it just makes so much sense. In order to be really good at anything, really, but in this case, rhetoric, you have to have natural ability, good instruction, and then diligent practice. Okay, just makes so much sense. And I just would maybe just immediately begin by contrasting that so thoroughly with the sort of thing that one takes for granted in the modern day age, where it all comes down to the teaching. That is a topic that, as a public school teacher myself, something that I've had to endure for a long time, the idea being that if kids are failing, then it's the teacher's fault. But of course, the truth is that teachers only make up 1/3 of the requisite kind of recipe for success in any subject. Inborn talent of some level, and of course, diligent work on the student's part, are also required. Well, in his earliest published work, De Inventione, or On Invention, written when he was about 17 years old, Cicero offers an explanation of the origin of eloquence. And he says the following: "And if we are inclined to consider the origin of this thing which is called eloquence, whether it be a study or an art or some peculiar sort of training or some faculty given us by nature, we shall find that it has arisen from most honorable causes, and that it proceeds on the most excellent principles. For there was a time when men wandered at random over the fields, after the fashion of beasts, and supported life on the food of beasts. Nor did they do anything by means of the reasoning powers of the mind, but almost everything as by bodily strength. No attention was as yet paid to any considerations of the religious reverence due to the gods, or of the duties which are owed to mankind. No one had ever seen any legitimate marriages. No one had beheld any children whose parentage was indubitable, nor had anyone any idea what great advantage there might be in a system of equal law. And so, owing to error and ignorance, cupidity, that blind and rash sovereign of the mind, abused its bodily strength, that most pernicious of servants, for the purpose of gratifying itself. At this time, then, a man, a great and wise man, truly he was, perceived what materials there were and what great fitness there was in the minds of men for the most important affairs, if anyone could draw it out and improve it by education. He, laying down a regular system, collected men who were previously dispersed over the fields and hidden in habitations in the woods into one place, and united them, and leading them on to every useful and honorable pursuit, though at first, from not being used to it, they raised an outcry against it. He gradually, as they became more eager to listen to him on account of his wisdom and eloquence, made them gentle and civilized, from having been savage and brutal. And it certainly seems to me that no wisdom, which was silent and destitute of skill in speaking, could have had such power as to turn men on a sudden from their previous customs, and to lead them to the adoption of a different system of life. And moreover, after cities had been established, how could men possibly have been induced to learn to cultivate integrity and to maintain justice and to be accustomed willingly to obey others and to think it right not only to encounter toil for the sake of the general advantage, but even to run the risk of losing their lives if men had not been able to persuade them by eloquence of the truth of those principles which they had discovered by philosophy? Undoubtedly, no one, if it had been that he was influenced by dignified and sweet eloquence, would ever have chosen to condescend to appeal to law without violence, when he was the most powerful party of the two as far as strength went, so as to allow himself now to be put on a level with those men among whom he might have been preeminent, and of his own free will to abandon a custom most pleasant to him, and one which by reason of its antiquity had almost the force of nature. And this is how eloquence appears to have originated at first, and to have advanced to greater perfection, and also afterwards to have become concerned in the most important transactions of peace and war, to the greatest advantage of mankind. Now, Cicero, while obviously keenly aware and knowledgeable of the whole tradition of rhetoric going back to the sophists, clearly has written these words, if you remember, with the sophist Protagoras' megas logos in mind, which we read in Plato's dialogue of the name Protagoras. The idea that speech, eloquent speech, is a necessary and kind of instrumental part in the establishment of society. Okay, and that law and justice and the putting aside of the old barbarous customs that characterize primitive tribes all are bound up with the use of eloquence. Some 30 years later, after writing these words, Cicero wrote his masterful treatise De Oratore, in which he constructs a portrait of his ideal speaker. The work is composed as a dialogue between several of the leading orators of the generation previous to Cicero's. The two main characters of the dialogue are Lucius Crassus and Marcus Antonius, Cicero's own boyhood mentors and the greatest orators of Rome at that time. And in the passage that we're going to look at right now, the Interlocutor Crisis refers to these same origins of eloquence. He extols the capacity for speech as one of the most powerful and efficacious of all human gifts, and encourages his young proteges to master the art of eloquence. He says, "Nor does anything seem to me more noble than to be able to fix the attention of assemblies of men by speaking, to fascinate their minds, to direct their passions to whatever object the orator pleases, and to dissuade them from whatsoever he desires. This particular art has constantly flourished above all others in every free state, and especially in those which have enjoyed peace and tranquility, and has ever existed and has ever exercised great power. For what is so admirable as that, out of an infinite multitude of men, there should arise a single individual who can alone, or with only a few others, exert effectually that power which nature has granted to all? Or what is so pleasant to be heard and understood as an oration adorned and polished with wise thoughts and weighty expressions? Or what is so striking, so astonishing, as that the tumults of the people, the religious feelings of the judges, the gravity of the Senate should be swayed by the speech of one man? Or what, moreover, is so kingly, so liberal, so munificent, as to give assistance to the suppliant, to raise the afflicted, to bestow security, to deliver from dangers, to maintain men in the rights of citizenship? What also is so necessary as to keep arms always ready, with which you may either be protected yourself or defy the malicious, or avenge yourself when provoked? Or consider that you may not always contemplate the forum, the benches, the rostrum, the Senate. What can be more delightful in leisure, or more suited to social intercourse than elegant conversation, betraying no want of intelligence on any subject? For it is by this one gift that we are most distinguished from brute animals, that we converse together and can express our thoughts by speech. Who therefore would not justly make this an object of admiration, and think it worthy of his utmost exertions to surpass mankind themselves in that single excellence by which they claim their superiority over brutes? But that we may notice the most important point of all, what other power could either have assembled mankind when dispersed into one place, or have brought them from wild and savage life to the present humane and civilized state of society, or when cities were established, have described for them laws, judicial institutions, and rights? And that I may not mention more examples, which are almost without number, I will conclude the subject in one short sentence. For I consider that by the judgment and wisdom of the perfect orator, not only his own honor, but that of many other individuals, and the welfare of the whole state, are principally upheld. Go on, therefore, as you are doing, young men, and apply earnestly to the study in which you are engaged, that you may be an honor to yourselves, an advantage to your friends, and a benefit to the Republic. Well, Cicero was obviously keenly aware and knowledgeable of the rules contained in the typical rhetorical treatises in his day, although he was highly critical of this sort of mere handbook learning. In fact, in this same work, De Oratore, Cicero routinely criticizes the hackneyed precepts of the handbooks. They perhaps serve, he says, a foundational purpose, but the ideal orator, and we might just say the ideally educated person, that's really what an orator is for Cicero and for the whole classical tradition, especially in the Roman way of looking at things. We will see the same thing next week with Quintilian. The ideal orator, the ideal educated person, in addition to knowledge of rhetorical rules, must possess a vast knowledge of all the humane arts, including history, literature, law, and philosophy. Such knowledge, along with natural ability, study, and diligent practice, are essential for winning any argument. He says, there is a certain observation to be paid, as he remarked, to those particulars which are most effective in oratory. But in such observation could make men, but if such observation could make men eloquent, who would not be so, right? If it was just a matter of rules, then who wouldn't do it? For who could not learn these particulars, if not with ease, at least in some way? But I think that of such precepts, the use and advantage is not that we may be directed by art to find out what we are to say, but that we may either feel certain as to what we attain by our own natural ability, by study and by training, that it is right, or to understand that it is wrong, having been instructed to what rule the several particulars are to be referred. This idea of finding out the truth through rhetoric, through the things that are gained by the education in rhetoric, and by using rhetorical speech as a means for arriving at philosophical truth, this is a very deep instinct inside of Cicero. The power wielded by a skillful speaker who knows how to persuade through artful speech and appeal to human emotions, this is a very powerful thing, but in the wrong hands, it is a very powerful weapon. It is therefore a two-edged sword, rhetoric, one that can be employed for either good or ill. One need only consider two extraordinarily effective 20th century orators who were embroiled in the same conflict, namely Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler, to illustrate this point graphically. In such a context, it is easy to see why the word rhetoric nowadays often carries with it a negative connotation. In ancient Greece, after the creation of a rhetorical system that was based largely on the principle of argumentation founded on, remember, probability, teachers of rhetoric, the sophists, emerged who rejected the ideal sphere of pure reason and absolute truth in favor of the probable and the relative. These same thinkers we saw extolled the power of the word, and they sometimes endeavored to make the worse case appear the stronger case. Philosophers like Socrates and Plato, on the contrary, as we saw, searching as they were for final and absolute ends, championed truth uncovered through dialectical inquiry instead. And therefore, this quarrel, this timeless quarrel between rhetoric and philosophy emerged at that time in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. And it is a quarrel that would endure in varying manifestations and in various levels of intensity, certainly down to Cicero's time, one might even say down to our own time. But certainly it was alive and well in Cicero's time. And in the opening paragraph of Cicero's De Inventione, Cicero reveals his thoughts on the matter. He says, I have often and deeply resolved this question in my mind, whether fluency of language have been beneficial or injurious to men and to cities, with reference to the cultivation of the highest order of eloquence. And when I consider the disasters of our own republic, and when I call to mind also the ancient calamities of the most important states, I see that it is by no means the most significant portion of their distresses which has originated from the conduct of the most eloquent men. But at the same time, when I set myself to trace back by the aid of written memorials and documents affairs which, by reason of their antiquity, are removed back out of the reach of any personal recollection, I perceive also that many cities have been established, many wars extinguished, many most enduring alliances and most holy friendships have been cemented by deliberate wisdom, much assisted and facilitated by eloquence. And as I have been, as I say, considering all this for some time, reason itself especially induces me to think that wisdom without eloquence is but of little advantage to states, but that eloquence without wisdom is often most mischievous and is never advantageous to them. If then anyone neglecting all the most virtuous and honorable considerations of wisdom and duty devotes his whole attention to the practice of speaking, that man is training himself to become useless to himself and a citizen mischievous to his country. But a man who arms himself with eloquence in such a manner as not to oppose the advantage of his country, but to be able to contend on behalf of them, he appears to me to be one who both as a man and a citizen will be of the greatest service to his own and the general interests and most devoted to his country. Well, several decades later, after writing this, in his work, the De Oratore, which I keep going back to, Cicero will speak in more detail concerning the quarrel between rhetoric and philosophy. And he will essentially strive to effect a reconciliation, or we might even say a synthesis of these two endeavors of the human mind, combining philosophy not so much with rhetoric, but with eloquence. Cicero's ideal orator, and again, we might just replace that with the phrase the ideal educated person, is an oratorical philosopher or a philosophical orator. Nonetheless, it is clear that to anyone familiar with Cicero's oratorical career that on several occasions he defended clients whom he knew to be guilty. And we might object to that. We might see that as a contradiction in terms of his own, belief system. And in fact, a later teacher of rhetoric, who we're going to learn about next week, Quintilian, reports to us that Cicero once boasted that in his defense of a client named Cluentius, he, quote, threw dust in the eyes of the jury, end quote. And indeed, that speech, the Pro Cluentio, was considered in antiquity Cicero's finest speech. Addressing his son near the end of his life, Cicero had something to say about this, about defending guilty clients. And it appears that our notion of granting every defendant a fair trial has had at least some of its foundation in Cicero's way of thinking. Listen to what he says, and you can decide for yourself whether this is simply rationalization or whether he's actually getting at something humane and true. The following rule of duty is to be carefully observed. Never prefer a capital charge against any person who may be innocent, for that cannot possibly be done without making oneself a criminal. For what is so unnatural as to turn to the ruin and destruction of good men the eloquence bestowed by nature for the safety and protection of our fellow men? And yet, while we should never prosecute the innocent, we need not have scruples against undertaking, on occasion, the defense of a guilty person, provided he be not infamously depraved and wicked. For people expect it, custom sanctions it, humanity also accepts it. It is always the business of the judge in a trial to find out the truth. It is sometimes the business of the advocate to maintain what is plausible, even if it be not strictly true. I will leave that in your court to decide whether or not is he being a little bit sophistic here, is he being a little bit like a sophist, or is he actually getting at something that is humane and in some larger sense correct. Well, moving on to a different topic now, let us discuss the parts of rhetoric, or what might be called the activities of the orator. Those who in antiquity taught and wrote about the art of persuasion regularly identified three genres of oratory, or we might even say three types of cases. Those were the judicial, or sometimes called forensic, coming from the word forum. These were suited to seeking justice in courts of law. Then there was the deliberative type of oratory, whose goal is to argue what is most beneficial or expedient in any public setting or before an assembly, or we might kind of put it in kind of like an op-ed piece or something like that. And then the last one is what is known as the epideictic, or demonstrative oratory, which is oratory meant for show, to praise somebody or to blame some topic. This is perhaps best illustrated in things like funeral orations or eulogies. Handbooks of the Hellenistic period and into the Roman period tended to concentrate on the judicial genre as perhaps being most crucial and as lending itself best to systematic exposition. Ancient theorists organized their presentation around 5 parts or activities of the orator, and these are this is all throughout the ancient tradition of oratory ever afterwards. So these 5 aspects or activities of the orator are invention, by which is meant the discovering or thinking out of the material, then arrangement, the ordering of the material, then the style, that is putting the ordered material into appropriate words, then memory, of course, memorization of the speech, and lastly, delivery, including directives about voice, even sometimes facial expressions, gestures, how much jewelry an orator should have, intonations of the voice and stuff like that. These parts or activities parallel the process through which a speaker proceeds when composing and delivering a speech. Now, one of the things we're going to see that at the collapse of the classical period, when the Roman Empire finally fell, it's typically dated to the 5th century AD in the West, you get a transference of all of this. We're kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but in Cicero's time, throughout the whole Roman time, oratory, literary education, language education, writing was all very much focused on the living word of speaking in front of an audience. That will shift, that will transfer over in the early Middle Ages to much more of a written word, where the written and read word is really the forum, the medium of exchange for ideas, as opposed to speaking alive in front of an audience. And we are very much inheritors of that still, in some sense. And, if you think of even the way language instruction is offered in high school or college, it is very much, sometimes you will get a public speaking class, but there's not so much of that. The focus is primarily more on the written word. And if you just were to kind of think about your own English instruction for composition, you basically get something like this 5-part structuring process for how to write a paper. Right? At least the first 3 parts, right? You have kind of like brainstorming, which is the invention process, the arrangement process, putting it all out there and, kind of format, organizing your essay. And then, of course, writing it, which would fall into the realm of style and putting your material into appropriate language. Memory and delivery are really not focused upon so much at all. So let's take a look at some of these. Go through each one of these 5 different parts of the kind of rhetoric, and starting with invention. The Latin word inventio is concerned, the idea of invention in the Latin sense is concerned with finding and thinking through the subject matter of the speech. The process chiefly involves identifying and classifying the question at issue according to a specific stance of argument, as well as discovering the most promising sources of proof for persuading one's audience. Now, what do I mean by stance of argument? Well, in judicial controversies, the charge of the prosecution and the counterclaim by the defense always will crystallize the question at issue, that is, the matter under judgment, which in turn is classified according to one of 4 stances. Okay, stances of argument. The Latin word is status, or you can also see sometimes constitutio. That is, according to the stand that is assumed by the defense. So Cicero succinctly outlines the system in his De Inventione. Let us read it together. Every subject that contains in itself some controversy in speech and debate involves a question about a fact, or about a definition, or about the nature or quality of an act, or about legal processes. You would choose one of those 4 ways of attacking your issue. Therefore, what I call the issue is the dispute which arises from the conflict of the 2 statements in this way. You have not done this lawfully. That would be the question of fact. I have done it lawfully. And this is the conflict of arguments. And on this, the statement of the case hinges. It arises, therefore, from that kind of dispute, which we call the question, in this way, whether he did so, and so lawfully. The reasoning is that which embraces the whole cause or case, and if that be taken away, then there is no dispute remaining behind the case. So in other words, if you're approaching an issue, and this is really a helpful thing for us to understand too, you have to kind of ask yourself, so a person is accused of a crime. Okay, did in fact this event take place? That's the first, that would be one way of approaching the issue. Maybe you're going to pursue that line of argument. No, it did not happen. Okay, and the argument is over the fact of the case. Another way of argument would be to say, well, yes, it did happen, but it's not actually illegal. Okay, so that would be like a kind of qualitative argument. Okay, that's about the definition. I'm sorry, that would be more like the quality of the act. The definition would be something, yes, it took place, but it does not fit the definition of what the crime is, and so on. It's different ways of approaching any particular issue, and so as to build one's argument. And then, of course, the next focus on this, once you kind of have decided what argument you're going to pursue, what stance you're going to take in the argument, is to deduce what sort of proofs you will use. Well, 300 years before Cicero's times, Aristotle wrote a book called The Rhetoric, in which he identified 2 kinds of available means of persuasion for winning one's case or argument. He divided these into what he called non-artistic and artistic proofs. Non-artistic proofs are those that the speaker does not invent by using his art. That's where the term comes from. For example, written contracts and the testimony of witnesses, all of those kind of legal documents, that would all fall under non-artistic proofs. But what about if there is no set thing? And certainly in our day-to-day lives, when we try to influence other people, or persuade or argue, try to explain our case to somebody in our family or a significant other or something. We don't have recourse to these kind of things. Well, in that kind of situation, persuasion takes an artistic route, which means the speaker does not use a document to try to persuade, but merely employs his art of persuasion. And there are three modes of persuasion Aristotle deduces. This will be familiar to you if you've studied AP rhetoric and composition in high school. They are the appeals to logos, rational argumentation, pathos, the arousal of emotions in the audience, and ethos, the presentation of character. Logos, pathos, and ethos. Cicero adopts this Aristotelian tripartite schema, and we see it reflected in the remarks made by one Antonius, one of the chief characters in De Oratore, as he describes his approach to handling the initial stages of invention. Let us read that. Number 7, when after hearing and understanding the nature of a case, I proceed to examine the subject matter of it, I settle nothing until I have ascertained to what point my whole speech bearing immediately on the question and case must be directed. I then very diligently consider two other points. The one, how to recommend myself, or those for whom I plead. The other, how to sway the minds of those before whom I speak to that which I desire. Thus, the whole business of speaking rests upon three things for success in persuasion: that we prove what we maintain to be true, that would be logos, that we conciliate those who hear, that is ethos, and that we produce in their minds whatever feeling our cause may require, that of course is pathos. For the purpose of proof, two kinds of matter present themselves to the orator, one consisting of such things as are not invented by him, but as appertain to the case, and are judiciously treated by him, such as deeds, testimonies, covenants, contracts, examinations, laws, acts of the Senate, precedents, decrees, opinions of lawyers, and whatever else is not found out by the orator, but brought under his notice by the case and by his clients. The other consisting entirely in the orator's own reasoning in arguments, so that as to the former heading, he has only to handle the arguments with which he is furnished. As to the latter, he invents arguments. Okay. Now, the so-called artistic means of persuasion, that is, those that are thought up or created by the speaker, often employ what in Greek are called topoi, or the English version of that would be topics, or in Latin, loci communes, or commonplaces. Okay, these are commonplace, or we might even say stereotypical logical categories or premises, the latter often ethical or political, upon which a speaker can build his logical arguments or his appeals to character and emotion. And this is what Cicero has to say about them. This is indeed the end of that part on which I just now entered. For it is now understood that all matters which admit of doubt are to be decided, not with reference to individuals who are innumerable, or to occasions which are infinitely various, but to general considerations and the nature of things, that general considerations are not only limited in number, but very few, that those who are studious of speaking should embrace in their minds the subject peculiar to the several departments of eloquence, arranged under general heads, as well as arrayed and adorned, I mean with thoughts and illustrations. These will by their own force beget words, which always seem to me to be elegant enough, if they are such that the subject seems to have suggested them. And if you ask the truth, as far that is as it is apparent to me, for I can affirm nothing more than my own notions and opinions, we ought to carry this preparatory stock of general questions and commonplaces into the forum with us, and not when any case is brought before us. We should not begin to seek for topics from which we may draw our arguments, topics which indeed by all who have made them the subject of but moderate consideration may be thoroughly prepared by means of study and practice. But the thoughts must still revert to those general headings and commonplaces to which I have so often alluded, and from which all arguments are drawn for every species of oratory. All that is required, whether it result from art or observation or practice, is but to know those parts of the field in which you may hunt for, and trace out what you wish to find. For when you have embraced in your thoughts the whole of any topic, if you are but well practiced in the treatment of subjects, nothing will escape you, and every circumstance material to the question will occur and will suggest itself to you. Well, rational argument has its foundation in two basic processes, which in logic we refer to as induction and deduction. Speakers today still rely on these weapons of logic to win any argument, employing induction by the use of example and deduction through syllogistic reasoning. Examples or analogies can be fictitious or historical, and from them you can argue by inducing a probable conclusion about the matter in dispute, and then offer a general or universal application drawn from the specific example in question. Such arguments generally are tripartite in nature, first presenting one or more similar cases, second stating the point we want conceded, for which the similar cases have been cited, and third, drawing a conclusion that reinforces the concession or demonstrates what results follow from it. A syllogism has the basic form of a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. For example, all human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is the classic example of a syllogism. In speeches and oral arguments, a speaker often relies on premises that are probable and not necessarily certain, and sometimes even omits the minor premise, thus expressing the earlier syllogism, as I've just said, as Socrates is mortal, because all humans are mortal. This is a sort of rhetorical syllogism, and it goes by the name of enthymeme. It's a syllogism with a suppressed middle term. So instead of saying all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, it would be Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. You see, now you could, so that's a kind of collapsed version of a syllogism called the enthymeme. In its more expansive form, it can actually go up to have five parts to it. An epichareme is the ancient Greek word for it. That is, a syllogism's major and minor premises are supported by further arguments, and then the conclusions are drawn. There's a very entertaining example of this sort of argumentation demonstrating induction, that is the use of example or analogy, as is related by Cicero in his De Inventione. He says the following things. In the writings of Aeschines, Socraticus, Socrates shows that Aspasia used to argue, this was the lover of Pericles in 5th century Athens, Aspasia used to argue with Xenophon's wife and with Xenophon himself. Tell me, I beg you, O wife of Xenophon, if your neighbor has better gold than you have, whether you prefer her gold or your own. Hers, she says. Suppose she has dresses and other ornaments suited to women, or of more value than those which you have. Should you prefer your own or hers? Hers, to be sure, answered she. Come then, says Aspasia, suppose she has a better husband than you have. Should you then prefer your own husband or hers? On this the woman blushed. But Aspasia began a discourse with Xenophon himself. I ask you, O Xenophon, says she, if your neighbor has a better horse than yours is, whether you would prefer your own or his horse. His, says he. Suppose he has a better farm than you have. Which farm, I should like to know, would you prefer to possess? Beyond all doubt, says he, that which is the best. Suppose he has a better wife than you have. Would you prefer his wife? And on this Xenophon himself was silent. Then spake Aspasia, since each of you avoids answering me the question alone, which was the only one which I wish to have answered, I will tell you what each of you are thinking. For both of you, O woman, wish to have the best husband, and you, O Xenophon, most exceedingly desire to have the most excellent wife. Wherefore, unless you both so contrive matters that there shall be not one, there shall not be on the whole earth a more excellent man or a more admirable woman, then in truth you will all at all times desire above all things that which you think to be the best thing in the world, namely that you, O Xenophon, may be the husband of the best possible wife, and you, O woman, that you may be married to the most excellent husband possible. After they had declared their assent to these far from doubtful propositions, it followed on account of the resemblance of the cases that if anyone had separately asked them about some doubtful point, that also would have been admitted as certain on account of the method employed in putting the question. Now, of course, you probably are thinking the whole time, this is some serious sophistry here. And of course it is, because it's a different kind of the sophistry, the abuse of logic here comes in this case by the word best. It is what's known as equivocation, where the word, where one word is used in one sense in the analogy and in a different sense in the thing that is being compared to. So the best gold and best jewelry have maybe an objective kind of value. They're, but best wife has a subjective value, you see. So you like your wife best, presumably, better than somebody else's, not because there's some objective standard there, but rather because, subjectively you love the individual in a way that cannot be quantified in an objective manner. In the same way that, you can't really say like this person, this mother is better than that mother or something like that, or this, I have the best mother. Everybody feels kind of, unless they're got a, difficulty there that they have, they wouldn't want to exchange their mother for anyone else, because they're, because there's a subjective quality there. So anyway, going further with the same idea of rational argumentation. In the following passage from De Inventione that we're going to look at, number 10, Cicero illustrates deductive reasoning in his outline of the Epicheremi, the expansive five-part syllogism. However, we should note that in proving the major premises here, induction, that is the use of example, is also employed. He says the following things. Those who think that a syllogism should be arranged in 5 parts say that the first part should state the thesis of the argument in this way. Those things which are done on some deliberate plan are better managed than those which are conducted without any steady design. This they call the first division, and then they think it right that it should be further proved by various arguments and by as copious statements as possible in this way. That house which is governed by reason is better appointed in all things, and more completely furnished than that which is conducted at random and on no settled plan. That army which is commanded by a wise and skillful general is governed more suitably in all particulars than that which is managed by the folly and rashness of anyone. The same principle prevails with respect to sailing, for that ship performs its voyage best which has the most experienced pilot. When the proposition has been proved in this manner, and when 2 parts of the ratiocination, the use of logic, have proceeded, they say in the 3rd part that it is desirable to assume from the mere intrinsic force of the proposition what you wish to prove. In this way, but none of all those things is managed better than the entire world. In the 4th division, they adduce besides another argument in proof of this assumption in this manner. For both the rising and setting of the stars preserve some definite order, and their annual commutations do not only always take place in the same manner by some express necessity, but they are also adapted to the service of everything, and their daily and nightly changes have never injured anything in any particular from being altered capriciously. And all these things are a token that the nature of the world has been arranged by no ordinary wisdom. In the 5th division, they bring forward that sort of statement which either adduces that sort of fact alone, which is compelled in every possible manner in this way. The world, therefore, is governed on some settled plan, or else when it has briefly united both the proposition and the assumption, it adds this which is derived from both of them together in this way. But if those things are managed better which are conducted on a settled plan than those which are conducted without such settled plan, and if nothing whatsoever is managed better than the entire world, therefore it follows that the world is managed on a settled plan. And in this way, they think that such arguments have 5 sections. Whew. That's a difficult one to get through, but I think you get the point. This would have been also a big part of rhetorical training, and indeed should be a part of any classical education, is the use of logic. Okay. Now, putting logic aside, though, for a moment, the second mode of or source of proofs is ethos. Okay, that is simply the ancient Greek word for character, and it is persuasion gained through the effective presentation of the speaker's character or the character of the person on whose behalf the speaker is pleading. The goal with the appeal to ethos is to win the approval and admiration of one's audience, which makes them ultimately more sympathetic to one's argument. Negative character portrayal of one's opponent is also an effective way to help your listeners or readers with your point of view. And in the following passage that we're now going to take a look at, Cicero expounds on the effectiveness of persuasion achieved through character portrayal. Let us read. Character portrayal contributes much to success in speaking, that the morals, principles, conduct, and lives of those who plead cases and of those for whom they plead should be such as to merit esteem, and that those of their adversaries should be such as to deserve censure, and also that the minds of those before whom the case is pleaded should be moved as much as possible to a favorable feeling, as well towards the speaker as towards him for whom he speaks. The feelings of the hearers are conciliated by a person's dignity, by his actions, by the character of his life, particulars which can more easily be adorned by eloquence if they really exist than be invented if they have no existence. But the qualities that attract favor to the orator are a soft tone of voice, a countenance expressive of modesty, a mild manner of speaking, so that if he attacks anyone with severity, he may seem to do so unwillingly and from compulsion. It is of peculiar advantage that indications of good nature, of liberality, of gentleness, of piety, of grateful feelings, free from selfishness and avarice, should appear in him, and everything that characterizes men of probity and humility, not acrimonious, nor pertinacious, nor litigious, nor harsh, very much conciliates benevolence and alienates the affections from those in whom such qualities are not apparent. The contrary qualities to these, therefore, are to be imputed to your opponents. This mode of address is extremely excellent in those cases in which the mind of the judge cannot well be inflamed by ardent and vehement incitation. For energetic oratory is not always desirable, but often smooth, submissive, gentle language, which gains much favor for defendants. Rei is the Latin term, a term by which I designate not only such as are accused, but all persons about whose affairs there is any litigation. For in that sense, people formerly used the word. To describe the character of your clients in your speeches, therefore, as just, full of integrity, religious, unpresuming, and patient of injuries, has an extraordinary effect. And such a description, either in the commencement or in your statement of facts, or in the peroration, has so much influence, if it is agreeably and judiciously managed, that it often prevails more than the merits of the case. That's such a great point, that all of these things, winning the trust and respect of your readers or your listeners, often prevails more than the merits of the case. Such influence indeed is produced by a certain feeling and art in speaking, that the speech seems to represent, as it were, the character of the speaker. And by adopting a peculiar mode of thought and expression, united with action that is gentle and indicative of amiableness, such an effect is produced that the speaker seems to be a man of probity, integrity, and virtue. In most cases, ethical persuasion is presented subtly and throughout a speech. Cicero likens it to blood flowing throughout the entire body. And by the end of the speech or argument, a particular portrait is to be drawn by for the hearers, both of the speaker and of his opponent, and often others who have something to do with the argument or the case in question. For example, that speech that kind of started Cicero's whole career on behalf of Roscius of Amaria in 80 BC, who was charged with the heinous crime of murdering his own father, a crime that is obviously horrible in any culture, but as literally as bad as it got in ancient Rome, where it was very patriarchal. Well, in this case, Cicero is defending this man. He was innocent, and he would get him off, but he was being he had been framed essentially because of the very complicated political situation at the time, and essentially this man, the man who was killed, the father, had owned a lot of really nice property that had been and that the person who killed him wanted, and got, because he had framed the son. Anyway, in this speech, Cicero repeatedly and consistently portrays his client as a simple, frugal farmer whose character could never entertain the thought of a crime as atrocious as parricide. Roscius's adversaries, on the other hand, are corrupted by their prodigality and prodded by their greed and audacity, and are therefore capable of any outrage. As Cicero points out in this very short passage from the middle of his speech, he says the following: "And in this I pass over the thing which might be a strong argument for me to prove his innocence. The atrocities of this sort are not usually produced among country manners, in a sober course of life, in an unpolished and rough sort of existence. As you cannot find every sort of crop, nor every tree in every field, so every sort of crime is not engendered in every sort of life. In a city, luxury is engendered. Avarice is inevitably produced by luxury. Audacity must spring from avarice, and of audacity arises every wickedness and every crime. But a country life, which you call a clownish one, is the teacher of economy, of industry, and of justice." A much more blatant use of the ethos or character-based proof is evidenced in a speech from the time of Cicero's consulship, that is the year 63 BC. Toward the end of this year in office, Cicero uncovered the plot to overthrow the government, masterminded by that man I mentioned earlier, Catiline, a nobly born but overly ambitious and totally unscrupulous senator who had actually been one of Cicero's fellow competitors for the consulship in the previous year. After denouncing Catiline in a meeting of the Senate, Cicero spoke to the Roman people in public assembly, presenting them with the facts surrounding the conspiracy. And in this speech, he makes blatant and unrestrained use of arguments based on character, as he endeavors to draw a sharp comparison between himself and the loyal citizens of Rome, on the one hand, and Catiline and his morally bankrupt followers on the other. As is readily evident in the passage we're going to read, no subtlety is at play here, but something more akin to character assassination. Incidentally, it is worth noting that ad hominem attacks and proof based on character, which more often than not are excluded from modern-day courtrooms, were not only permitted, but even expected in a Roman setting. Let's take a look. "There is a last class, last not only in number, but in the sort of men and in their way of life, the especial bodyguard of Catiline, of his levying, yes, the friends of his embraces and of his bosom, whom you see with carefully combed hair, glossy, beardless, or with well-trimmed beards, with tunics and with sleeves, or reaching to the ankles, clothed with veils, not with robes." This is all kind of like too much luxury. "All the industry of whose life, all the labor of whose watchfulness is expended in suppers lasting till daybreak. In these bands are all the gamblers, all the adulterers, all the unclean and shameless citizens. These boys, so witty and delicate, have learnt not only to love and be loved, not only to sing and to dance, but also to brandish daggers and to administer poisons. And unless they are driven out, unless they die, even should Catiline die, I warn you that the school of Catiline would exist in the Republic. But what do those wretches want? Are they going to take their wives with them to the camp? How can they?" There was a camp of these, after Catiline was driven out of Rome, he went to his kind of brigand army in Etruria. to the north of Rome. How can they do without them, especially in these nights? And how will they endure the Apennines, that is a mountain range, and these frosts and the snow, unless they think that they will bear the winter more easily because they have been in the habit of dancing naked at their feasts? Oh, war, much to be dreaded, when Catiline is going to have his bodyguard of prostitutes. Array now, O Romans, against these splendid troops of Catiline, your guards and your armies, and first of all oppose to that worn-out and wounded gladiator, your consuls and generals. Then against that banished and enfeebled troop of ruined men, lead out the flower and strength of all Italy. I have no need to compare the rest of your troops and equipment and guards with the want and destitution of that highwayman. But if omitting all these things in which we are rich and of which he is destitute, the Senate, the Roman knights, the people, the city, the treasury, the revenues, all Italy, all the provinces, foreign nations, if I say, admitting all these things, we choose to compare the cause themselves, which are opposed to one another, the causes themselves, which are opposed to another. In other words, what we're fighting for and what they're fighting for. We may understand from that alone how thoroughly prostrate they are. For on the one side are fighting modesty, on the other wantonness. On the one chastity, on the other uncleanness. On the one honesty, on the other fraud. On the one piety, on the other wickedness. On the one consistency, on the other insanity. On the one honor, on the other baseness. On the one continence, on the other lust. In short, equity, temperance, fortitude, prudence, all the virtues contend against iniquity with luxury, against indolence, against rashness, against all the vices. Lastly, abundance contends against destitution, good plans against baffled designs, wisdom against madness, well-founded hope against universal despair. In a contest and war of this sort, even if the zeal of men were to fail, will not the immortal gods compel such numerous and excessive vices to be defeated by these most eminent virtues? The third source of proof is pathos, or persuasion won through appeal to the audience's emotions. The speaker's goal here is to sway or move, movere in Latin, the feelings of his listeners so that they will side emotionally with him. Appealing to the emotions, of course, is a tactic as old as speech itself, and the Greeks and Romans both employed verbal and nonverbal appeals. One might recall that Socrates, in his defense speech, the Apologia, asserted that he would not resort to emotional appeals. For example, bringing his children into the courtroom, dressing in mourning clothes, and weeping, in front of them to secure his acquittal. Cicero realized the great power of argument based on emotional appeal, often calling it the most effective means of persuasion. For him, ethos involved knowledge and exploitation of the milder emotions, while pathos dealt with the more violent emotions. And in his work, the De Oratore, the interlocutor Antonius continues with his description of pathos. He says, to this mode of speaking, that is ethos, we may subjoin the opposite method, which moves the mind of the judges by very different means and impels them to hate or love or envy or benevolence or fear or hope or desire or abhorrence or joy or grief or pity or severity, and leads them to whatever feelings resemble and are allied to these and similar emotions of mind. It is desirable, too, for the orator that the judges may voluntarily bring to the hearing of the case some feelings in their breasts favorable to the object of the speaker. For it is easier, as they say, to spur on a willing horse than it is to rouse a sluggish one. But if such shall not be the case, or be somewhat doubtful, then as a careful physician, before he proceeds to administer any medicine to a patient, he must not only understand the disease of him whom he would cure, but also his habit and constitution of body when in health. So I, for my part, when I undertake a case of such doubt and importance as is likely to excite the feelings of the judges, I employ all my sagacity on the care and consideration of ascertaining as skillfully as I can what their sentiments and opinions are, what they expect, what to which side they incline, and to what conclusion they are likely to be led with the least difficulty by the force of oratory. In other words, know your audience. If they yield themselves up and, as I said before, voluntarily incline and predominate to the side to which I would impel them, I embrace what is offered and turn my sails to that quarter whence any breath of wind is perceived to blow. But if the judge is unbiased and free from all passion, it is a work of greater difficulty, for every feeling must then be moved by the power of oratory without any assistance from nature. But so great are the powers of that which was rightly termed by a good poet incliner of the soul and queen of all things, eloquence, that it cannot only make him upright who is biased, or bias him who is steadfast, but can, like an able and resolute commander, lead even him captive who resists. Antonius, in the same speech, next goes on to assert that in order to be most effective in stirring the emotions, the speaker himself should actually feel those emotions he helps to evoke. This is such an important point for Cicero that in order to be a good speaker, you kind of have to be a big ham. In some ways, it's kind of like acting. You really have to get into character, get into the, into the groove. It cannot be just a purely disinterested, business-like, presentation. And this character, Antonius, in the dialogue, describes his own appeal to pathos in one of the more famous examples of such sort of linguistic pyrotechnics, if I may. He says the following: "Do not therefore imagine that I, who had no desire to imitate or represent the calamities of fictitious sorrows of the heroes of antiquity in my speech, and was no actor of a foreign and personated part, but a supporter of my own, when Manius Aquilius, by my efforts, was to be maintained in his rights as a citizen, did that which I did in the peroration of that cause. Case, without a strong feeling. For when I saw him whom I remembered to have been consul, and as a general honored by the Senate, to have marched up to the Capitol with the pomp of an ovation, afflicted, dejected, sorrowful, reduced to the last extremity of danger, I no sooner attempted to excite compassion in others than I was myself moved with compassion. I observed, indeed, that the judges were wonderfully moved when I brought forward the sorrowful old man, habited in mourning, and did what you, Crassus, commend, not with art, of which I know not what to say, but with great concern and emotion of mind, so that I tore open his garment and showed his scars. When Gaius Marius, who was present and sat by, heightened the sorrow and expressed in my speech by his tears. And when I, frequently calling upon him, recommended his colleague to his protection and invoked him as an advocate to defend the common fortune of commanders. This excitement of compassion, this adjuration of all gods and men, of citizens and allies, was not unaccompanied by my tears and extreme commiseration on my part. And if from all the expressions which I then used, real concern of my own had been absent, my speech would not only have failed to excite commiseration, but would have even deserved ridicule." Cicero was well known for his own effective use of pathos in his speeches, often employing the grand style, full of emotion, to sway the jury in his client's favor. And in the passage that we will now read, taken from the conclusion or peroration of his defense of his friend Plancius, Cicero pulls out all the emotional stops to secure the acquittal of his client, who was on trial for illegal election activities. A few years before the trial, when Plancius had been stationed in Thessalonica, he offered shelter and support to Cicero, who had been exiled at that time from Rome. You remember, a victim of the machinations of his archenemy Clodius. Throughout the speech, and especially here at its end, Cicero makes allusion to Plancius's aid to him in his hour of darkness, and he links Plancius's current plight with his own situation then while in exile. He says the following: "Oh, what miserable nights of watching did you pass, O Gnaeus Plancius, Oh, what tearful vigils! Oh, what bitter nights! Oh, what a miserable task was that which you undertook of protecting my life. If I, now that I am alive, and am unable to be of any service to you, though perhaps I might have been of some if I had been dead, for I recollect, I well recollect, and never shall forget, that night when I, miserable man that I was, and led on by ungrounded hopes, made you, who were watching over me and sitting by me and lamenting some vain and empty promises. I promised that if I were to be restored to my country, then I would in person show my gratitude. But if chance deprived me of life, or if any greater violence prevented my return, then I undertook that these men, these whom we see here, for what others could I then be thinking of, would make you a fitting return on my behalf for all your exertions. Why do you fix your eyes upon me now? Why do you claim the performance of my promise? Why do you implore my observance of good faith? I was not promising you at that time anything from my own resources, but from the goodwill of these men towards me. I saw that these men were mourning for me, that they were groaning for me, that they were willing to do battle in defense of my rights and safety, even at the hazard of their own lives. I, as well as you, was hearing every day of the regret and grief and complaints of these men, and now I fear that I may be able to make you no other return beyond tears, of which you yourself shed plenty for my distresses. For what can I do more than grieve, more than weep, more than consider your safety bound up with my own? The same men who gave me safety are the only men who have the power to give it to you. But I, rise up and stand forward, I beg you. I will cling to you and embrace you, and I will profess myself not only one who prays to the judges to protect your fortunes, but one who will be your companion and partner in them. And as I hope, no one will be of so cruel and inhuman a disposition, nor so unmindful, I will not say of the services which I have done the good, but of the services which the good have done me, so as to tear away and separate the Savior of my very existence as a citizen from me. I beg you, O judges, to save a man who has been not loaded with kindnesses by me, but the guardian of my safety. I am not striving in his behalf and with wealth and authority and influence, but with prayers and tears and appeals to your mercy. And his unhappy and most virtuous father, whom you see before you, he joins his entreaties to mine. We, being as it were two parents of his, pray your mercy for our one son. Do not, O judges, I entreat you in the name of yourselves, of your fortunes, and of your children, give joy to my enemies, especially to those whom I have made my enemies by laboring for your safety, by allowing them to boast that you have by this time forgotten me, and that you have shown yourselves enemies to the safety of the man by whom my safety was ensured. Do not crush my spirit, not only with grief, but also with fear that your kind regard for myself is altered. Allow me to pay the man from you that which I repeatedly promised him because I relied on you. And you, O Gaius Flavius, you I beg and entreat, you who were the partner of my counsels during my consulship and the sharers of my dangers and my assistant in the exploits which I performed, and who have at all times wished me to be not only safe but prosperous also and flourishing. I entreat you, I say, to preserve for me by the instrumentality of these men that man to whom it is owing that you see me preserved to them and to you. It is not only my own tears, but yours also, O Flavius, and yours too, O judges, that hinder me from saying more. And by them I, though I am in a state of great apprehension, and am induced to hope that you will show yourselves the same men with reference to the saving of Plancius that you did in my case, since by those tears which I now behold, I am reminded of those which you so repeatedly and abundantly shed for my sake. Moving on now to the next part. Arrangement is the second part of rhetoric, or the second activity of the speaker. Now, equipped with the subject matter for one's argument or speech, having determined the issue at hand, having thought out the appropriate supporting arguments drawn from the sources of proof, and having identified commonplaces through which to present these arguments, it is now time to arrange or organize one's speech appropriately into parts. By most accounts, a judicial speech in its basic form has 4 parts: an introduction or prologue, a narration or statement of the case, an argument, including a refutation of opposing arguments, and a conclusion. Deliberative speeches may sometimes assume a different structure. Moreover, at times a speaker might find it appropriate to add a proposition, a statement, or division of his arguments, a digression even, an excursus on some related facet of the case, often on the character or actions of one of the principles involved. In De Oratore, Cicero's interlocutor Antonius responds to an earlier comment from his friend Catullus and gives advice on the arrangement of material. He says the following point: "I now return, therefore, to that point, Catullus, on which you a little while ago accorded me praise, the order and arrangement of facts and topics of arguments. On this heading, 2 methods may be observed. One, which the nature of causes dictates, the other, which is suggested by the orator's judgment and prudence. For to premise something before we come to the main point, then to explain the matter in question, then to support it by strengthening our own arguments and refuting those on the other side, next to sum up and then come to the peroration, is a mode of speaking that nature herself prescribes. But to determine how we should arrange the particulars that are to be advanced in order to prove, to inform, to persuade, this is the classic sort of, 3 goals of oratory: docere, delectare, and suadere. These more peculiarly belong to the orator's discretion, for many arguments occur to him, many that seem likely to be of service in his pleading, but some of them are so trifling as to be utterly contemptible. So if they are of any assistance at all, are sometimes of such a nature that there is some defect inherent in them, while that which appears to be advantageous is not of such import that it need be advanced in conjunction with anything prejudicial. And as to those arguments which are to the purpose and deserving of trust, if they are, as it often happens, very numerous, I think that such of them as are of least weight, or as are of the same tendency with others of greater force, ought to be set aside and excluded altogether from our pleading. I myself, indeed, in collecting proofs, make it a practice rather to weigh than to count them, since, too, as I have often observed, we bring over people in general to our opinions by 3 methods: by instructing their understandings, conciliating their benevolence, and exciting their passions, logos, pathos, and ethos. One only of these 3 methods is to be professed by us, so that we may appear to desire nothing else but to instruct. The other 2, like blood throughout the body, ought to be diffused through the whole of our pleading, for both the beginning and the other parts of a speech, on which we will by and by say a few words, ought to have this power in a great degree, so that they may penetrate the minds of those before whom we plead, in order to excite them. But in those parts of the speech which, though they do not convince by argument, yet by solicitation and excitement produce great effect, though their proper place is chiefly in the exordium and the peroration, that is, the introduction and conclusion, still to make a digression from what you have proposed and are discussing, for the sake of exciting the passions, is often advantageous. Since after the statement of the case has been made, an opportunity often presents itself of making a digression to rouse the feelings of the audience, or this may be properly done after the confirmation of our own arguments, or the refutation of those on the other side, or in the other place, or in all, if the case has sufficient copiousness and importance. And those cases are the most considerable and most pregnant with matter for amplification and embellishment, which afford the most frequent opportunities for that kind of digression, in which you may descant on those points by which the passions of the audience are either excited or calmed. Speaking of the exordium, the prologue of the speech is a passage designed to bring the audience into the proper state of mind in order to receive the rest of our argument. To accomplish this goal, the speaker should strive to secure the attention of his listeners, to make them receptive and ready to receive argumentation, and to win their goodwill. Ancient handbooks generally contain detailed descriptions of tactics that are effective in meeting these goals. Cicero's earliest extant Oration, this is his speech on behalf of Quinctius, pro Quinctio, offers a fine example of an exordium, one particularly aimed at securing the sympathy and goodwill of his listeners, while at the same time disposing them unfavorably toward his opponents. The case is a relatively complicated one involving a dispute over property possession, and in his introduction, Cicero draws effective character sketches, that is, ethos, of those involved in the case. One, Naevius, the powerful and unscrupulous adversary; Hortensius, his patron, the eloquent and well-established lawyer; Quinctius, the poor, downtrodden defendant; and Cicero himself, Quinctius, his patron, who is working at a great disadvantage, and whose abilities and experience pale in comparison to those of his opponent. Additionally, Cicero's characterization of an appeal to one Gaius Aquilius, chief assessor in the case, demonstrates his rather blatant efforts at securing the goodwill of his audience for the remainder of the speech. Let us read that now. This is his exordium. The two things which have the greatest influence in a state, namely the greatest interest and eloquence, are both making against us at the present moment. And while I am awed by the one, O Gaius Aquilius, I am in fear of the other. I am somewhat awed, apprehending that the eloquence of Quinctius Hortensius may embarrass me in speaking, but I am in no slight fear that the interest of Sextus Naevius may injure Publius Quinctius. And yet it would not seem so disastrous for us that these things should exist in the highest degree in the other party. If they existed also to a moderate extent in us, but the fact is that I, who have neither sufficient experience nor much ability, am brought into comparison with a most eloquent advocate, and that Publius Quinctius, who has but small influence, no riches, and few friends, is contending with a most influential adversary. And moreover, we have this additional advantage, that Marcus Junius, who has several times pleaded this case before you, O Aquilius, a man practiced in the conduct of other cases also, and much and frequently concerned in this particular one, is at this moment absent, being engaged on his new commission, and so they have had recourse to me. Even if I had all the other requisite qualifications in ever so high a degree, have certainly scarcely had time enough to be able to understand so important a business, having so many points to dispute involved in it. So that also, which has been used to be an assistance to me in other cases, is wanting to me in this one. For in proportion to my want of ability, have I endeavored to make amends for that want by industry. And unless time and space be given to one, it cannot be seen how great his industry is. But the greater our disadvantages, O Gaius Aquilius, are, with so much the more favorable a disposition ought you, and those who are your colleagues in this trial, to listen to our words, that the truth, though weakened by many disadvantages, may be at last reestablished by the equity of such men as you. But if you, being the judge, shall appear to be no protection to a desolate and helpless condition against power and influence, if before this tribunal the case is found to depend on interest, not on truth, then indeed there is nothing any longer holy and uncontaminated in the state. no hope that the firmness and virtue of the judge may counterbalance the lowly condition of anyone. But undoubtedly before you and your colleagues, truth will prevail, or else if it be driven from this place by power and influence, it will not be able to find any place where it can stand. I do not say this, O Gaius Aquilius, because I have any doubt of your own good faith and constancy, or because Publius Quinctius ought not to have the greatest hopes from those whom you have called in as your assessors, being as they are among the most eminent men in the state. What then? In the first place, the magnitude of the danger causes a man the greatest fear, because he is staking all his fortunes on one trial. And while he is thinking of this, the recollection of your power does not occur to his mind less frequently than that of your justice, because all men whose lives are in another's hand more frequently think of what he, in whose power and under whose dominion they are, can do, than of what he ought to do. Secondly, Publius Quinctius has for his adversary in name and deed Sextus Naevius, but in reality the most eloquent, the most gallant, the most accomplished men of our state, who are defending Sextus Naevius with one common zeal and with all their power, if indeed defending means so to comply with the desire of another, that he may the more easily be able to overwhelm whomsoever he chooses by an unjust trial. For what, O Gaius Aquilius, can be mentioned or spoken of more unjust or more unworthy than this, that I, who am defending the liberties, the fame, and fortunes of another, should be compelled to open the case, especially when Quintius Hortensius, who in this trial fills the part of the accuser, is to speak against me, a man to whom nature has given the greatest possible fluency and energy in speaking. Matters are so managed that I, who ought rather to ward off the darts of our adversary and to deal the wounds he has inflicted, am compelled to do so now, even when the adversary has cast no dart, and that time is given to them to attack us when the power of avoiding their attacks is to be taken from us. And if in any particular they should, as they are well prepared to do, cast any false accusation like a poisoned arrow at us, there will be no opportunity for applying a remedy, since Publius Quinctius, involved in and overwhelmed by such numerous and great difficulties, has taken refuge, O Gaius Aquilius, in your good faith, in your truth, in your compassion, when up to this time, owing to the might of his adversaries, no equal law could be found for him, no equal liberty of pleading, no just magistrate, when through the greatest injustice everything was unfavorable and hostile to him, he now prays and entreats you, O Gaius Aquilius, and all of you who are present as assessors, to allow justice, which has been tossed about and agitated by many injuries, at length to find rest and a firm footing in this place. Well, after the introduction comes the narratio, or narration or statement of facts. It is the second part of a speech. Facts, of course, can be a slippery term, and the notion of imparting spin to a story is as old as speech itself. Each speaker attempts to state his version of the facts of the case in a way that will be most beneficial to his argument. Rhetorical handbooks tell us that the ideal narration should possess three qualities: brevity, clarity, and persuasiveness, or plausibility. One of the finest examples of an effective narration in Cicero's corpus comes from his defense of Titus Annius Milo, who was accused of murdering his rival Publius Clodius, the same Clodius who had instigated Cicero's exile earlier. Basically what happened was that Milo and his gang, politics had reached a point in the late Republic of Rome where the politicians would have rival gangs basically attack each other on sight. We're getting there, I think, in our own society. But Milo's gang had met Clodius and his gang along the Appian Way in January of 52 BC. And while this meeting probably occurred by chance, Cicero was intent on showing that his client, the unsuspecting Milo, was ambushed intentionally by Clodius. who then happened to be killed in the fray by Milo's gang. And this is the narration of those events. It's quite wonderful. In order that you may the more easily discern this, attend carefully, I entreat you, while I briefly explain to you the matter as it occurred. When Publius Clodius had determined to distress the Republic by all sorts of wickedness during his consulship, and saw that the comitia, that is the public hearings, were so delayed the year before that he would not be able to continue his praetorship many months, as he had no regard to the degree of honor as others have, but both wished to avoid having Lucius Paulus, a citizen of singular virtue, for his colleague, and also to have an entire year to manage the Republic. On a sudden, he abandoned his own year and transferred himself to the next year, not from any religious scruple, but that he might have, as he said himself, a full and entire year to act as praetor, that is, to overthrow the Republic. It occurred to him that his praetorship would be crippled and powerless if Milo were consul, and moreover, he saw that he was being made consul with the greatest unanimity of the Roman people. He betook himself to his competitors, but in such a manner that he alone managed the whole election, even against their will, that he supported on his own shoulders, as he used to say, the whole comitia. He convoked the tribes, he interposed, he erected a new Colline tribe by the enrollment of the most worthless of the citizens. In proportion as the one caused greater confusion, so did the other acquire additional power every day. When the fellow, prepared for every atrocity, saw that a most brave man, his greatest enemy, was a most certain consul, and that was declared not only by the conversation of the Roman people, but also by their votes, he began to act openly and to say without disguise that Milo must be slain. He had brought down from the Apennines rustic and barbarian slaves, whom you saw, with whom he had ravaged the public woods of Etruria. The matter was not concealed at all. In truth, he used to say undisguisedly that the consulship could be taken from Milo, but that the consulship could not be taken from Milo, but that his life could be. He often hinted as much in the Senate. He said plainly in the public assemblies. Besides, when Favoninus, a brave man, asked him what he had hoped for by giving way to such madness while Milo was alive, he answered him that in 3 or at most 4 days he would be dead. And this saying of his, Favoninus immediately reported to Marcus Cato, who is here present. In the meantime, as Clodius knew, and it was not hard to know, that Milo was forced to take a yearly legitimate necessary journey on the 20th of January to Lanuvium to appoint a priest, because Milo was dictator of Lanuvium. On a sudden, he himself left Rome the day before, in order, as was seen by the event, to lay an ambush for Milo in front of his farm, and he departed, so that he was not present at a turbulent assembly in which his madness was greatly missed, and which was held that very day, and from which he never would have been absent if he had not desired to avail himself of the place and opportunity for a crime. But Milo, as he had been that day in the Senate till it was dismissed, came home, changed his shoes and his garments, waited a little, as men do, while his wife was getting ready, and then started at the time when Clodius might have returned, if indeed he had been coming to Rome that day. Clodius meets him unencumbered, on horseback, with no carriage, with no baggage, with no Greek companions, as he was used to, without his wife, which was scarcely ever the case. And while this plotter, who had taken, forsooth, that is, in truth, that journey for the express purpose of murder, was driving with his wife in a carriage, in a heavy traveling cloak, with abundant baggage and a delicate company of women and maidservants and boys. He meets Clodius in front of his farm about the 11th hour, which would be about, I think, 5 o'clock in the evening, or not far from it. Immediately, a number of men attack him, and the higher ground with missile weapons. The men who are in front kill his driver, and when he had jumped down from his chariot and flung aside his cloak, and while he was defending himself with vigorous courage, the men who were with Clodius drew their swords. and some of them ran back towards his chariot in order to attack Milo from behind. And some, because they thought that he was already slain, began to attack his servants who were behind him. And those of the servants who had presence of mind to defend themselves and were faithful to their master were some of them slain, and the others, when they saw a fierce battle taking place around the chariot, and as they were prevented from getting near their master so as to help him, when they heard Clodius himself proclaim that Milo was slain, and they thought that it was really true, they, the servants of Milo, I'm not speaking for the purpose of shifting the guilt onto the shoulders of others, but I'm saying what really occurred. He did, without their master either commanding it or knowing it, or even being present to it, what everyone would have wished his servants to do in a similar case. That's quite a narration of events, but you get the idea. The next section in a Latin oration, Roman oration, would be the confirmatio, or proof of one's case, in which the orator relies chiefly on methods of rational argumentation for persuasion. On some occasions, the speaker may choose to introduce the confirmation with a partition, the Latin simply is partitio, in which he briefly outlines what his arguments are with his opponents and what is left in dispute, or more often he'll mention in a methodical way what he intends to discuss in the proof. Cicero in his De Inventione has this to say about the confirmatio process. The confirmation or proof is that part of a speech through which our case gains credit, authority, and support through the marshalling of arguments. All propositions are confirmed in argument by attributes of persons or attributes of actions. We consider the following to be attributes of persons: name, nature, manner of life, fortune, habit, feelings, interests, purposes, achievements, accidents, and speeches made. The attributes of actions are partly coherent with the action itself, partly considered in connection with the performance of the action, partly adjunct with the action, and partly consequent upon the performance of the action. But every argument drawn from these common topics that we have mentioned will have to be either probable or irrefutable. For to define it briefly, argumentation appears to be something devised which either shows something in a probable manner or demonstrates it in an irrefutable one. Those things are demonstrated irrefutably, which can neither be done nor proved in any other manner whatsoever than that in which they are stated. The probable is something that generally is accustomed to happen, or what is generally among people's ordinary beliefs, or contains in itself some resemblance to these qualities, whether that resembles to be true or false. Cicero then goes on to elaborate on each of these categories and subdivisions. And in the following passage that we're going to read now, taken from the confirmatio of that same speech of Cicero's on behalf of Milo, we can see it clearly on display. We recall that in defending his client Milo, who is charged with having murdered Clodius, Cicero is endeavoring to prove that Clodius actually set the ambush for Milo, who was merely defending himself against attack. This passage illustrates several arguments that rely on the principles of proof and argumentation just mentioned by Cicero, particularly on the notion of probability. In that connection, Cicero earlier in the speech had invoked the famous legal maxim of Cassius Longinus, cui bono, whose benefit, who stood to gain by this action. It was a question invoked by ancient jurists and still invoked today in court when attempting to establish the probability of motive. Cicero resumes the theme here of cui bono, who benefits, and continues with his arguments based on probability and advantage. We read the following: I see that all things up to this point are plain and consistent, that it was even desirable for Milo that Clodius should live, that for Clodius the death of Milo was the most advantageous thing possible, with reference to those objects of which he had set his heart, that he bore him the most bitter hatred, but that Milo had no such feelings towards him, that the one lived in a perpetual round of violence, that the other's habits were limited to repelling it, that Milo had been threatened by him with death, and that his death had been openly predicted by him, that no such expression had ever been heard from Milo, that the day of Milo's journey was well known to Clodius, but that Clodius's return was unknown to Milo, that the journey of the one was inevitable, but that of the other was even inconvenient to himself, that the one had openly declared that on that day he should set out from Rome, that the other had concealed the fact of his intending to return on that day, that the one had in no respect whatsoever changed his intention, that the other had invented a false pretense for changing his mind, that the one, if he were plotting, would naturally wish night to come on when he was near the city, while arrival at the city by night was to be feared by the other, even if he had no apprehension of danger from this man. Let us consider now this, which is the main point of all, for which of the two the identical spot where they did meet was the best suited for planning the ambush. But is that, O judges, a matter about which one can possibly doubt or think seriously for a moment? In front of Clodius's farm, that farm in which, on account of those absurd erections and excavations for foundations of his, there were pretty well 1,000 vigorous men employed, on that high and raised ground belonging to his adversary, did Milo think that he should get the better in the contest? And had he, with that view, selected that spot above all others? Or was he rather waited for in that place by a man who had conceived the idea of attacking because of the hopes of that particular spot suggested to him? In fact, O judges, the facts, O judges, speak for themselves, facts which are always of the greatest weight in a case. If you were not hearing of this transaction, but were looking at a picture of it still, it would be quite visible which of the two was the plotter, which was thinking no evil, when one of the two was driving in a chariot wrapped up in a mantle with his wife sitting by his side. It is hard to say which was the greatest hindrance to him, his dress or his carriage or his wife. How could a man be less ready for battle than when he was entangled in a mantle as in a net, hampered with a carriage, and fettered as it were by his wife clinging to him? Look, on the other hand, at Clodius, first setting out from his villa, all on a sudden. Why? It was evening. Why was he forced to set out at such a time? Going slowly. What was the object of that, especially at the time of night? He turns aside to the villa of Pompeius to see Pompeius. He knew that he was near Alsium. To see the villa, he had been in it 1,000 times. What then was his object? Delay. He wanted to waste the time. He did not choose to leave the spot till Milo arrived. Come now, compare the journey of this unencumbered bandit with all the hindrances which beset Milo. Before this time, he always used to travel with his wife. Now he was without her. He invariably went in a carriage. Now he was on horseback. His train were a lot of Greeklings wherever he was going, even when he was hastening to the camp in Etruria. But this time there were no triflers in his retinue. Milo, who was never in the habit of doing so, did by chance have with him some musical slaves belonging to his wife and troops of maidservants. The other man, who was always carrying with him prostitutes, worn out debauchees, both men and women, this time had no one with him except such a band that you might have thought every one of them picked men. Why then was he defeated? Because the traveler is not always murdered by the robber. Sometimes the robber is killed by the traveler. Because although Clodius, in a state of perfect preparation, was attacking men wholly unprepared, still it was the case of a woman falling upon men. Going hand in hand with one's proof or argument is the refutatio, or refutation of one's opposing argument. And Cicero says the following: then support for the case must be built by demolishing your opponent's arguments and by proving your own at the same time. For in every case, the portion of the speech that serves to establish your argumentation is, so to speak, based on just one principle, and this needs both confirmation and refutation. But because what is alleged on the other side cannot be refuted unless you confirm your own statements, and your own statements cannot be confirmed unless you refute the allegations of the opposite side, these matters are in consequence united both by their nature, by their object, and by their mode of treatment. And in his De Inventione, Cicero outlines 4 ways for which to refute one's opponent's arguments. Every argument is refuted in one of these ways. If one or more of its assumptions is not granted, if the assumptions are granted, it is denied that a conclusion can be drawn from them. The actual form of argument is shown to be fallacious, or a strong argument is countered by one equally strong or stronger. Well, in 62 BC, Cicero defended his friend, a former teacher and native Greek, Archias, on a charge of claiming Roman citizenship falsely, a charge that, if proven, would have resulted in Archias's expulsion from Rome. And in the following passage, Cicero refutes claims that have been made or likely would be made by the prosecution. He says, if we have nothing else to speak about except the rights of citizenship and the law, I need say no more. The cause is over. For which of all these statements, O Gratius, that's the judge, can be invalidated? Will you deny that he was enrolled at the time I speak of as a citizen of Heraclea? There is a man present of the very highest authority, a most scrupulous and truthful man, Lucius Lucullus, who will tell you not that he thinks it, but that he knows it, not that he has heard of it, but that he saw it, not even that he was present when it was done, but that he actually did it himself. Deputies from Heraclea are present, men of the highest rank. They have come expressly on account of this trial, with a commission from their city, and to give evidence on the part of their city. And they say that he was enrolled as a Heraclean. On this you ask for the public registers of the Heracleans, which we all know were destroyed in the Italian War, when the registrar office was burnt. It is ridiculous to say nothing of the proofs which we have, but to ask for proofs which it is impossible for us to have. To disregard the recollection of men, and to appeal to the memory of documents, and when you have the conscientious evidence of a most honorable man, the oath and good faith of a most respectable municipality, to reject those things which cannot by any possibility be tampered with, and to demand documentary evidence, though you say at the same time that that is constantly played tricks with. But he had no residence at Rome. What? Not he who, for so many years before the freedom of the city was given to him, had established the abode of all his property and fortunes at Rome. But he did not return himself. Indeed, he did. And in that return, which alone obtains with the College of Praetors the authority of a public document. For as the returns of Appius were said to have been kept carelessly, and as the trifling conduct of Gabinius before he was convicted, and his misfortune after his condemnation had taken away all credit from the public registers, yet Metellus, the most scrupulous and moderate of all men, was so careful that he came to Lucius Lentulus, the praetor, and to the judges, and said that he was greatly vexed at an erasure which appeared in one name. In these documents, therefore, you will see no erasure affecting the name of Archias. You say you search in vain for Archias's name on your own census rolls. To be sure, I suppose it is a great secret that at the time of the last census, he was with that most illustrious general, Lucius Lucullus, with the army, that at the time of the preceding one, he was with the same man when he was in Asia as quaestor, and that in the census before that, when Julius and Crassus were censors, no regular account of the people was taken. But since the census does not confirm the right of citizenship, but only indicates that he who is returned in the census did at that time claim to be considered as a citizen, I say that at that time when you say in your speech for the prosecution that he did not even consider himself that he had any claim to the privileges of a Roman citizen, he more than once made a will according to our laws, and he entered upon inheritances left him by Roman citizens, and he was made honorable mention by Lucius Lucullus, both as praetor and as consul, in the archives kept in the treasury. Search for arguments if you find any, for Archias will never be convicted of falsehood, neither by his own judgment nor that of his friends. Of course, the conclusion, or peroratio, is the final part of a standard speech or argument, during which one can sum up or recapitulate previous arguments and or stir the listener's emotions, either by exciting indignation against one's opponent or arousing pity or sympathy for oneself or the person for whom one is speaking. As a result, the epilogue is a favorite portion of a speech for employing pathos as a primary mode of persuasion. We have already talked about a pathos-laden passage from the epilogue of Cicero's speech on behalf of Plancius, and the following excerpt comes from the peroration or conclusion of Cicero's speech on behalf of his young protege Marcus Caelius, delivered in 56 BC. And although Caelius was charged on 5 counts, including violence and attempted poisoning, Cicero based his defense to a large extent on arguing that the charges had actually been trumped up by a woman behind the scenes, one Clodia, sister of that same arch-enemy of Cicero's, Clodius, who was, according to Cicero's account, Caelius's older, conniving, and vindictive ex-lover. Cicero argues that Caelius has sown his wild oats and is now ready to follow in his mentor's footsteps, assuming a role of leadership in the state. And noteworthy in this passage is also Cicero's efforts at both stirring up indignation against Caelius's and Cicero's enemies, and evoking pity and sympathy by introducing into the court Caelius's elderly father. Let us read. The case has now been fully stated by me, O judges, and summed up. You now understand how important an action this is which has been submitted to your decision, how serious a charge is confided to you. You are presiding over an investigation into a charge of violence, into a law which concerns the empire, the majesty of the state, the condition of the country, and the safety of all the citizens. A law which Quintus Catullus passed at a time when armed dissensions were dividing the people, and when the Republic was almost at its last gasp. A law which, after the flame which raged so fiercely in my consulship had been allayed, extinguished the smoking relics of the conspiracy. Under this law, the youth of Marcus Caelius is demanded, not for the sake of enduring any punishment called for by the Republic, but in order to be sacrificed to the lust and profligate pleasures of a woman. Preserve, therefore, to the Republic, O judges, a citizen devoted to the liberal studies, and to the most virtuous party in the state, and to all good men. I promise you this, and I give this understanding to the Republic, provided we ourselves have by our own conduct given satisfaction to the Republic, that Caelius's conduct will never be at variance with our own. And I promise not only because I rely on the intimacy that subsists between him and me, but also because he has taken upon himself already the obligation of the most stringent engagements. For a man who has ventured on such a step as that of prosecuting a man of consular rank because he says that the Republic has been injured by his violence, cannot possibly behave as a turbulent citizen in the Republic himself. A man who will not allow another to be at peace, even after he has been acquitted of bribery and corruption, can never himself become a briber of others with impunity. A man who will not allow another to be at peace, even the Republic, O judges, has 2 prosecutions which have been carried on by Marcus Caelius as pledges to secure it from any danger from him and guarantees of his goodwill and devotion. Therefore, I do pray and entreat you, O judges, after Sextus Clodius has been acquitted within these few days in the city, a man whom you have seen for the last 2 years acting on all occasions as the minister or leader of sedition, a man who has burnt sacred temples and even the census of the Roman people and all the public records and registers with his own hands, a man without property, without honesty, without hope, without a home, without any character or position, polluted in face and tongue and hand and in every particular of his life, a man who has degraded the monument of Catullus, who has pulled down my house and burnt that belonging to my brother, who on the Palatine Hill and in the sight of all the city stirred up the slaves to massacre and to the conflagration of the city. I entreat you, I say, not to suffer that man to have been acquitted in this city by the influence of a woman, and at the same time to allow Marcus Caelius to be sacrificed in the same city to a woman's lusts. I entreat you never to permit the same woman, in conjunction with a man who is at the same time her brother and her husband, to save a most infamous robber and to overwhelm a most honorable and virtuous young man. And when you have given due consideration to the fact of his youth, then place also before your eyes, I entreat you, the old age of his miserable father, whom you see before you, whose whole dependence is on his only son, who reposes on the hopes which he has formed of him, who fears nothing but the disasters which may befall him. Support, I pray you, that old man now, a suppliant for your mercy, the slave of your power, who, while he throws himself at your feet, so appeals more strongly still to your virtuous habits and to your kind and right feelings. Support him, I say, moved either by the recollection of your own parents or by the affection with which you regard your own children, so as, while relieving the misery of another, to yield to your own pious or indulgent positions. Do not, O judges, cause this old man, who is already, by the silent progress of nature, declining and hastening to his end, to fail prematurely through a wound inflicted by you, before the day which his natural destiny has appointed for him. Do not overthrow this other man, now flourishing in the prime of life, now that his virtue has just taken firm root, as it were by some whirlwind or sudden tempest. Preserve the son for the father for the son, lest you should appear either to have despised the old age of a man almost in despair, or on the other hand, not only to have abstained from cherishing, but even to have struck down and crushed a youth pregnant with the greatest promise. And if you do preserve him to yourselves, to his own relations, and to the Republic, you will have him dedicated, devoted, and wholly bound to you and to your children, and you will enjoy, O judges, in the greatest possible degree, the abundant and lasting fruits of all his exertions and labors. Now that we have concluded our survey of the various parts of an oration, we return now to the different canons or activities of the orator, and we come to the third of those, which is style. The third part of rhetoric, or the third activity of the orator, in Latin, elocutio, or style, elocution. This is now after one has planned what to say, inventio, and after one has decided in the order in which to put it in, arrangement. Now one must decide how to say it by casting one's subject matter into language, actual words and sentences. The same subject matter can obviously be expressed in very different ways and in different words. So the object of this third activity is to choose effective words and to connect those words into sentences, employing periodic structure, prose rhythm, a very important consideration in ancient oratory, and figures of speech. In Cicero's De Oratore, he is emphatic about the inseparable bond between subject matter and expression, that is, between content and words. Verbiage that flows without having its origin in knowledge and the subject matter is quite empty and ridiculous, while even brilliant content can be obscured by a poor choice of words or by their ineffectual connection. He says the following: for as every speech consists of the subject matter and the language can have no place if you take away the subject matter, nor the subject matter receive any illustration if you take away the language. Eloquence informs a unity, whether into whatever realms or areas of discourse it travels, whether it discourses concerning the nature of the heavens or of the earth, whether of divine and human power, whether it speaks from a lower or an equal or a superior place, whether to impel an audience or to instruct or to deter or to incite or to dissuade or to inflame or to soothe, whether to a small or to a large assembly, whether to strangers, to friends, or alone. Its language is derived through different channels, not from different sources. And wherever it directs its course, it is attended with the same equipment and decoration. But since we are overwhelmed by opinions, not only those of the vulgar, but those also of men imperfectly instructed, who treat of those things more easily when divided and torn asunder, which they have not capacity to comprehend in a general view, and whosoever and they who sever the language from the thoughts, like the body from the soul, neither of which separations can be made without destruction. I will not undertake in this discourse more than that which is imposed upon me. I will only signify briefly that neither can embellishments of language be found without arrangement and expression of thoughts, nor can thoughts be made to shine without the light of language. Now, there is, of course, no single style that is alone excellent, no single way of choosing words and configuring them into sentences that is superior to all others. Cicero recognizes this point and is emphatic in stressing that each speaker's individual strengths and weaknesses must be ascertained and appropriate. Stylistic proclivities must be encouraged and developed in each case. And he gives some rather salutary advice for teachers of composition still to this day. He says, for instance, but if between us who are present, there are such remarkable differences, such decided peculiarities in each of us, and in all this variety, the better is distinguished from the worse by difference in ability rather than by difference in kind. And everything is praiseworthy that is perfect in its nature. What do you imagine must be the case if we should take into consideration all the orators that anywhere exist or ever existed? Would it not happen that almost as many kinds of eloquence or as of orators would be found? But from this observation of mine, it may perhaps occur to you that if there be almost innumerable varieties and characters of eloquence, dissimilar in species yet laudable in their kind, things of so diversified a nature can never be formed into an art by the same precepts and one single method of instruction. This is not the case, and it is to be attentively considered by those who have the conduct and education of others in what direction the natural genius of each seems principally to incline him. For we see that from the same schools of artists and masters eminent in their respective pursuits, there have gone forth pupils very unlike each other, yet all praiseworthy, because the instruction of the teacher has been adapted to each person's natural genius. A fact of which the most remarkable example, to say nothing of other sciences, is that saying of Isocrates, an eminent teacher of eloquence, that he used to apply the spur to Ephorus, but put the rein on Theopompus. For the one who overleapt all bounds in the boldness of his expressions, he restrained. The other, who hesitated and was bashful, as it were, he stimulated. Nor did he produce in them any resemblance to each other, but gave to the one such an addition and retrenched from the other so much superfluity as to form in both that excellence of which the natural genius of each was susceptible. Discussions concerning style in Cicero's time were usually organized either around the four qualities or virtues of style, as defined by Aristotle's student Theophrastus, or according to three or more types or characters. The virtues of style are the correct use of Greek or Latin in Cicero's case, English in ours, and those would be clarity, distinction or ornamentation, which includes tropes such as metaphors, figures of speech, and figures of thought, and appropriateness. The best known categorization of types or characters of style is the threefold division in the three types of style. That would be the plain style, the middle style, and the grand style. Now I'd like to turn our discussion to the issues of style. In the De Oratore, Cicero's interlocutor Crassus speaks briefly about the first two qualities of style and makes it clear that all literate speakers are already in possession of these virtues, though study and further reading of the orators and poets will strengthen and enhance them. He says, "And tell me, what manner of elocution can be better than that of speaking in pure Latin, with distinction, with gratefulness, and with aptitude and congruity to the subject in question? Of the two which I mentioned first, purity and clearness of language, I do not suppose that any account is expected from me, for we do not attempt to teach him to be an orator who cannot speak, nor can we hope that he who cannot speak grammatical Latin will speak elegantly, nor that he who cannot speak what we can understand will ever speak anything for us to admire. But all elegance of language, though it receive a polish from the science of grammar, is yet augmented by the reading of orators and poets. For those ancients who could not then adorn what they expressed had almost all a kind of nobleness of diction, and those who are accustomed to their style cannot express themselves otherwise than in pure Latin, even though they desire to do so. Yet we must not make use of such of their words as our modern mode of speaking does not admit, unless sometimes for the sake of ornament, but sparingly, as I shall explain. But he who is studious and much conversant with ancient writers will make such use of common expressions as always to adopt the most eligible. In order to speak pure Latin, we must take care not only to use words with which nobody can justly find fault, and preserve the construction by proper cases and tenses and genders and numbers, so that there may be nothing confused or incongruous or preposterous, but also that the tongue and the breath and the tone of the voice come under proper relation. I would not have letters sounded with too much affectation, or uttered imperfectly through negligence. I would not have the words dropped out without expression or spirit. I would not have them puffed and, as it were, painted forth with a difficulty of breathing. Let us therefore pass over the rules for speaking the Latin tongue in its purity, which the teaching given to children conveys, which refined knowledge and method in study, or the habit of daily and domestic conversation cherishes, and which books and the reading of the ancient orators and poets confirm. Nor let us dwell long upon that other point, so as to discuss by what means we may succeed in making what we say understood. An object which we shall doubtless effect by speaking good Latin, adopting words in common use, and such as aptly express what we wish to communicate or explain, without any ambiguous word or phrase, not making our sentences too long, not making such observations as are drawn from other subjects for the sake of comparison too prolix, avoiding all incoherency of thought, reversion of the order of time, all confusion of persons, all irregularity of arrangement whatsoever. In short, the whole matter is so easy that it often appears astonishing to me that what the advocate would express should be more difficult to understand than he who employs the advocate would be if he were to speak of his own business. This third quality of style, ornamentation or distinction as it's oftentimes called, traditionally received the most attention by ancient rhetorical theorists. Included in this category are things such as tropes or turnings of phrase, that is, substitutions of one term for another as in metaphor, changes in the sequence or sounds of words, that is, figures of speech such as alliteration or anaphora, figures of thought such as rhetorical questions designed to emphasize a thought or involve the audience more directly, and cadence and rhythm, the effective arrangement of our words to render not strict metrical patterns, but rhythms that make our prose pleasing to the ear. As mentioned before, Cicero felt strongly that style must be rooted firmly in content In fact, that is actually, it must reside in content rather than being something foreign that is applied to it artificially, like cosmetics. And like all things that are truly distinctive, judicial use and tasteful variation are the secrets to a truly distinctive style. And he says the following thing. A speech then is to be made becoming in its kind with a sort of complexion and substance of its own, for that it be weighty, agreeable, savoring of erudition and liberal knowledge, worthy of admiration, polished, having feeling and passion in it, as far as it is required, are qualities not confined to particular members, but are apparent in the whole body. But that it be, as it were, strewn with flowers of language and thought, as a property which ought not to be equally diffused throughout the whole speech, but at such intervals that, as in the arrangement of ornaments, there may be certain remarkable and luminous objects disposed here and there. Such a kind of eloquence, therefore, is to be chosen as is most adapted to interest the audience, such as may not only delight, but delight with satiety. It is difficult to tell what the cause is, why, from those objects which most strongly strike our senses with pleasure and occasion the most violent emotions at their first appearance, we should soonest turn away with a certain loathing and satiety. How much more florid, in the gaiety and variety of the coloring, are most objects in modern pictures than in ancient ones, which, however, though they captivate us at first sight, do not afford any lasting pleasure, whereas we are strongly attracted by rough and faded coloring in the paintings of antiquity. How much softer and more delicate are fanciful modulations and notes in music than those which are strict and grave. And yet, if the former are often repeated, not only persons of an austere character, but even the multitude raise an outcry against them. We may perceive, too, in regard to the other senses, that we take a less permanent delight in perfumes composed of the sweetest and most powerful odors than in those of a more moderate scent, that is more commended, which appears to smell like wax, than that which is as strong as saffron, and that in the sense of feeling itself there is a limit required both to softness and smoothness. How soon does even the taste, which of all our senses is the most desirous of gratification, and is delighted with sweetness beyond the others, nauseate and reject that which is too luscious? Who can take sweet drinks and meats long together, while in both kinds of nutriment, such things as affect the sense with but a slight pleasure are the furthest removed from that satiating quality? And so in all other things, loathing still borders upon the most exquisite delights. And therefore, we should the less wonder at this effect in language, in which we may form a judgment, either from the poets or the orators, that a style elegant, ornate, embellished, and sparkling, without intermission, without restraint, without variety, whether it be prose or poetry, though painted with the brightest colors, cannot possibly give lasting pleasure. And we the sooner take offense at the false locks and paint of the orator or poet for this cause, that the senses, when affected with too much pleasure, are satiated, not from reason, but constitutionally. In writings and in speeches, these disguised blemishes are even more readily noticed, not only from the judgment of the ear, but from that of the understanding. Though such expressions of applause, therefore, as very well, excellent, may be often repeated to me, I would not have beautifully, pleasantly come too often. Yet I would have the exclamation, nothing can be better, very frequent. But this high excellence and merit in speaking should be attended with some portions of shade and obscurity, that the part on which a stronger light is thrown may seem to stand out and become more prominent. The fourth quality of virtue of style is appropriateness or propriety. That is, fitting to one's speech or arrangement the most appropriate style for that particular occasion, for the opponent, and for the audience. We might dub this knowing one's audience. And Cicero says the following in De Oratore. It is, however, clear that no single kind of style can be adapted to every case, or every audience, or every person, or every occasion. For capital cases require one style of speaking, private and inferior cases another. Deliberations require one kind of oratory, panegyric another, judicial proceedings another, common conversation another, consolation another, reproof another, disputation another, historical narrative another. It is of consequence also to consider who from the audience, whether the Senate or the people or the judges, whether it is a large or small assembly or a single person, and of what character. It ought to be taken into account, too, who the speakers themselves are, of what age, rank, and authority, and the time also, whether it be one of peace or of war, of hurry or leisure. On this heading, therefore, no direction seems possible to be given but this, that we adopt a character of style fuller, plainer, or middling, suited to the subject on which we are to speak. The same ornaments we may use almost constantly, but sometimes in a higher, sometimes in a lower strain, and it is the part of art and nature to be able to do what is becoming on every occasion, to know what is becoming, and when is an affair of judgment. This point is further elaborated upon by Cicero in a more philosophical and reflective manner in his work, the Orator. The foundation of eloquence, just as everything else, is wisdom. In a speech, just as in life, nothing else is more difficult than to discern what is appropriate. The Greeks call it to prepon. Let us call it appropriateness, decorum. Many brilliant precepts have been handed down about this, and this subject is most worthy of our consideration. Ignorance of what is appropriate causes mistakes not only in life, but very often also in poetry and public speaking. Moreover, the speaker must pay attention to appropriateness, not only in his thoughts, but also even in his words. For not every position, not every age, nor every time or place or audience should be treated with the same style of words or thoughts. In every part of our speech, as in every part of life, we must consider what is appropriate. And this depends on the subject matter that is being discussed, as well as on the characters of the speakers and the listeners. Thus, the philosophers are accustomed to treat this extensive topic under the subject of moral duties, though not when they are discussing absolute virtue, for that is one and unchanging. Teachers of literature consider it in connection with poetry, eloquent speakers in dealing with every kind and every part of their case. How inappropriate it is to employ general topics in amplified language when, before a single judge, you are pleading a case about the drainage of rainwater, or to use a low-key, submissive tone when speaking about the majesty of the Roman people. These err in every respect, while others make a mistake in terms of character, either their own or that of the jurors or of their opponents, and not only in substance, but also often in the use of words. Although a word has no force apart from the thing, the same thing is still often either approved or rejected, depending on how it's being expressed by one word or another. And in all cases, the question must be how far? For although each subject has its own limits of appropriateness, too much is generally more offensive than too little. And Apelles used to say that those painters who do not have a sense of what is enough also make the same mistake. But if the poet avoids inappropriateness as the greatest fault, and even makes a mistake when he places the speech of an upright man in the mouth of a villain, or that of a wise man in the mouth of a fool, or if a painter, in a scene of the sacrifice of Iphigenia, when he has portrayed Calchas as sad, Ulysses as more sad, and Menelaus as grieving, recognizes that Agamemnon's head must be veiled, since his supreme sorrow could not be captured by brush. If finally even the actor searches for what is appropriate, what then do we think the orator should do? Since this is of such importance, let the orator consider what to do in his cases and in their various parts. It is certainly obvious that not only the different parts of a speech, but even entire cases must be handled now in one style, now in another. An alternative way to discuss style was to classify it according to various types or characters, most commonly three: the plain, the middle, and the grand. Cicero employs this tripartite classification in his work, The Orator, but takes it a step further by adding a unique and original variation. He correlates the Aristotelian artistic sources of proof, logos, pathos, and ethos, with the Latin verbs probare, to prove, delectare, to delight or to charm, and flectere, to sway, and identifies each with one of the stylistic types. This is what he says. The eloquent speaker whom we seek will be the one who will speak in the forum and the courts in such a way as to prove and to delight and to sway. Those are those three words there: probare, movere, probare, delectare, and flectere. To prove is a necessity. To delight to delight adds charm. To sway brings victory. For of all things, this one is the most potent weapon for winning cases. For these three functions of the speaker, there are three styles: the plain style for proving, the middle style for delighting, and the vigorous style for swaying. And in this last resides the full force of a speaker. The one who manages and, as it were, combines these three different styles will need to be in possession of keen judgment and very high ability. For he will judge what is required in any situation and will be able to speak in whatever way the case demands. While it is clear that Cicero favors the grand style as the one that possesses the most power and persuasive weight, he insists that the best speakers should be masters of all three styles, knowing how and when to employ each and how to modulate them accordingly. A steady diet of the grand style, for instance, will only lead to disaster. He says about the grand style: the speaker of the grand style is abundant, copious, stately, and distinctive, and he certainly wields the greatest power. For this, the speaker whose distinctiveness and fluency of speech have caused admiring nations to allow eloquence to hold sway in the state. And this is the sort of eloquence that rushes on its course with a mighty roar, that all extol, that all admire, that all despair of attaining. This eloquence plies the hearts of people and moves them in every possible way. This eloquence now shatters the senses, now insinuates himself into them. It sows new ideas and uproots firmly planted ones. But there is a great difference between this style and the others. One who has worked diligently on the plain and incisive style, so to speak, with skill and accuracy, and has not contemplated anything higher, is, in respect to the perfection of his single style, a great orator, though not the greatest. He will not find himself on slippery ground, and once he has taken a stand, he will never fall. The speaker of the middle style, whom I call moderate and tempered, will not fear the doubtful and uncertain hazards of speaking, provided he has deployed his forces satisfactorily. Even if, as happens often, he is not completely successful, he will still not be in great danger, for he cannot fall very far. But this speaker of ours, whom we deem the chief, the stately, fierce, and fiery, if he has inborn talent of his own, or has trained himself in this one style, or has studied only this and does not temper his copiousness with the other two styles, is much to be despised. For the speaker in the plain style, because he speaks accurately and adroitly, is considered wise. The one employing the middle style, charming. But the very copious speaker, if there is nothing else to him, tends to appear insufficiently sane. For someone who can say nothing calmly, nothing mildly, nothing in an organized way, precisely, distinctly, or wittily, especially when some cases demand such treatment entirely and others largely so, if he begins to inflame the situation without first preparing the ears of his audience, he appears to be nothing more than a raving maniac among the sane, a drunk reveler in the midst of the sober. In the work, the Rhetorica ad Herennium, or Rhetoric to Herennius, This is a work that was preserved among the works of Cicero and was for over 1,000 years believed to have been by Cicero, has been decisively proven by modern scholars, actually not just modern scholars, really scholars from the Renaissance. It has been proven that it was a work not authored by Cicero, though its content and date are in fact very close to those of Cicero's youthful work, the De Inventione. In any case, the anonymous author of the Rhetorica ad Herennium classifies style according to the categories of the grand, the middle, and the plain, and he gives the following examples of each one. A course will be composed in the grand style if to each idea are applied the most ornate words that can be found for it, whether literal or figurative. If impressive thoughts are chosen, such as are used in amplification and appeal to pity, and if we employ figures of thought and figures of diction which have grandeur, these I shall discuss later. The following will be an example of this type of style. Who of you, pray, men of the jury, could devise a punishment drastic enough for him who has plotted to betray the fatherland to our enemies? What offense can compare with this crime? What punishment can be found commensurate with this offense? Upon those who had done violence to a freeborn youth, outraged the mother of a family, wounded or, basest crime of all, slain a man, our ancestors exhausted the catalogue of extreme punishments, while for this most savage and impious villainy they bequeath no specific penalty. In other words, indeed, injury arising from another's crime extends to one individual, or only to a few, but the participants in this crime are plotting with one stroke the most horrible catastrophes for the whole body of citizens. Oh, such men of savage hearts! Oh, such cruel designs of such human beings bereft of human feeling! What have they dared to do? What can they now be planning? They are planning now our enemies, after uprooting our fathers' graves and throwing down our walls, shall with triumph cry rush into the city. How, when they have despoiled the temples of the gods, slaughtered the conservatives, and dragged all others into slavery, and when they have subjected matrons and freeborn youths to a foeman's lust, the city, put to the torch, shall collapse in the most violent of conflagrations. They do not think, these scoundrels, that they have fulfilled their desires to the utmost, unless they have gazed upon the piteous ashes of our most holy fatherland. Men of the jury, I cannot in words do justice to the shamefulness of their act, yet that disquiets me but little, for you have no need of me. Indeed, your own hearts, overflowing with patriotism, readily tell you to drive this man, who would have betrayed the fortunes of all, headlong from his commonwealth, which he would have buried under the impious domination of the foulest enemies. That's the grand style. Our discourse will belong to the middle style if we have somewhat relaxed our style and yet have not descended to the most ordinary prose, as follows. Men of the jury, you see against whom we are waging war, against allies who have been wont to fight in our defense, and together with us to preserve our empire by their valor and zeal. Not only must they have known themselves their resources and their manpower, but their nearness to us and their alliance with us all in all affairs, and enable them no less to learn and appraise the power of the Roman people in every sphere. When they had resolved to fight against us, on what, I ask, did they rely in presuming to undertake the war, since they understood that much the greater part of our allies remained faithful to duty, and since they saw that they had at hand no great supply of soldiers, no competent commanders, and no public money, in short, none of the things needed to carry on a war. Even if they were waging war with neighbors on a question of boundaries, even if, in their opinion, one battle would decide the contest, they would yet come to the task in every way better prepared and equipped than they are now. It is still less credible that with such meager forces they would attempt to usurp that sovereignty over the whole world which all the civilized peoples, kings, and barbarous nations have accepted, in part compelled by force, in part of their own will, when conquered either by the arms of Rome or by her generosity. Someone will ask, what of the Fragellans? Did they not make the attempt on their own initiative? Yes, But these allies would be less ready to make the attempt precisely because they saw how the Fragellans fared. For inexperienced peoples, unable to find in history a precedent for every circumstance, are through imprudence easily led into error, whilst those who know what has befallen others can easily from the fortunes of these others draw profit for their own policies. Have they then, in taking up arms, been impelled by no motive? Have they relied on no hope? Who will believe that anyone has been so mad as to dare, with no forces to depend on, to challenge the sovereignty of the Roman people? They must, therefore, have had some motive, and what else can this be but what I say? That's the middle style. Now, of the simple style, which is brought down to the most ordinary speech of every day, the following will serve as an example. Now, our friend happened to enter the baths, and after washing was beginning to be rubbed down. Then, just as he decided to go down into the pool, suddenly his fellow turned up. "Say, young chap," said he, "you slave boys have just beat me. You must make it good." The young man grew red, for at his age he was not used to being hailed by a stranger. This creature started to shout the same words, and more in a louder voice. With difficulty the youth replied, "Well, but let me look into the matter." Right then the fellow cries out in that tone of his that might well force blushes from anyone. This is how aggressive and harsh it is. A tone certainly not practiced in the neighborhood of the sundial, I would say, but backstage and in places of that kind. The young man was embarrassed, and no wonder, for his ears still rang with the scoldings of his tutor, and he was not used to abusive language of this kind. For where would he have seen a buffoon, with not a blush left, who thought of himself as having no good name to lose, so that he could do anything he liked, without damage to his reputation? Thus, the examples themselves are enough to make clear the types of style. For one arrangement of words is of the simple style, another again belongs to the grand, and another belongs to the middle. And Cicero, in his Orator, offers 3 of his own speeches as examples of the plain, middle, and grand style. He says, "My defense on behalf of Caecina," that is the Pro-Caecina, "concerned itself entirely with the words of the praetor's provisional order. We explain complicated matters through the process of definition, praised the civil law, and drew distinctions between ambiguous terms. In the Manilian law, that is the Pro Lege Manilia, glorification of Pompey was the goal. We set forth that glorification richly with a speech in the middle style. My defense of Rabirius, the Pro Rabirio, was involved with all aspects of the principle of upholding the dignity of the state. Therefore, in this speech, we blazed forth in every manner of rhetorical amplification." And if we want to go further with that, I'm going to give you right now an extract from the Pro-Caecina, wherein Cicero employs the plain style as he endeavors to demonstrate the inadequacy of words in describing complicated or subtle legal concepts. The spirit of the law must take precedence over the letter. That's his kind of point in all of this. And this is how he puts it forth, again, in the plain style. "What law, what resolution of the Senate, what edict of a magistrate, what treaty or covenant, to return to men's private affairs, what will, what judicial decision, what bond, what formula of bargain or agreement cannot be invalidated and torn to pieces if we choose to bend facts to words and to leave out of the question the intention and design and authority of those who wrote them? In truth, even our familiar and daily discourse will cease to have any coherence if we set traps with words for one another. Do not different examples in each separate class occur to every one of you, which may be a proof that right does not depend upon only on the strict words of the law, but the words are meant to be subservient to the intentions and purposes of men? In a most elegant and fluent manner did Lucius Crassus, by far the most eloquent of all men, a little before I became active in the forum, defend this opinion in a trial, and with great ease too, though that very sagacious man, Quintus Mucius, was arguing against him. Crassus provided to everyone that Marcus Curius, who had been named heir in the event of the death of a posthumous son, was entitled to be named heir, although the son was not dead, since in fact a son had never been born. Well, was this case sufficiently provided for by the terms of the will? Certainly not. What was the thing, then, that influenced the judges? The intention. And if it could be understood, though we were silent, we should not employ words at all, because it could not. Words have been invented not to hinder people's intentions, but to point them out. The law commands the property in land to be determined by 2 years' possession, but we adopt the same principle also in the case of houses, which are not mentioned at all in the law. If a road is not properly made, the law allows a man to drive a beast of burden wherever he likes. Can it be understood from this that if a road in the Brutii be out of repair, a man may, if he pleases, drive his beast through the Tusculan farm of Marcus Scaurus? There is a right of action against a vendor who is present, according to this formula, since I behold you before the court. Now, the blind Appius could never have availed himself of this form of action if men adhered to words with such strictness as not to consider the matter for the sake of which the words are used. If a person's heir had been stated in his will to be the minor Cornelius, and if Cornelius were 20 years old, according to your interpretation, he would lose his inheritance. Well, in 66 BC, the year of Cicero's praetorship, Gaius Manilius, one of the tribunes, proposed a law granting the general Pompey supreme command over the province of Asia, that would be modern-day Turkey. And this was in the war that Rome was waging with Mithridates at the time, king of Pontus. Cicero spoke in favor of the law at the time, and he later cites his speech as a prime example of the middle style. His task, as he says, was to praise the character and ability of the general Pompey. And now I'm going to give you a sample of that so you can kind of get a feeling of what the middle style is like. Come now, consider also what moderation he meaning Pompey, has displayed in other matters also. How was it, do you suppose, that he was able to display that excessive rapidity and to perform that incredible voyage? For it was no unexampled number of rowers, no hitherto unknown skill in navigation, no new winds which bore him so swiftly to the most distant lands. But those circumstances which are wont to delay other men did not delay him. No avarice turned him aside from his intended route in pursuit of some plunder or other. No lust led him away in pursuit of pleasure. No luxury allured him to seek its delights. The illustrious reputation of no city tempted him to make its acquaintance. Even labor did not turn him aside to seek rest. Lastly, as for the statues and pictures and other embellishments of Greek cities, which other men think worthy of carrying away, he did not think them worthy even of a visit from him. And therefore everyone in those countries looks upon Gnaeus Pompeius as someone descended from heaven, not as someone sent out from this city. Now, they began to believe that there really were formerly Romans of the same moderation, which hitherto has seemed to foreign nations a thing incredible, a false and ridiculous tradition. Now the splendor of your dominion is really brilliant in the eyes of those nations. Now they understand that it was not without reason that when we had magistrates of the same moderation, their ancestors preferred being subject to the Roman people to being themselves lords of other nations. But now the access of all private individuals to him is so easy that complaints of the injuries received from others are so little checked that he who in dignity is superior to the noblest men, in affability seems to be on a par with the meanest. How meanest meaning the lowest. How great his wisdom is, how great his authority and fluency in speaking, and that too is a quality in which the dignity of a general is greatly concerned. You, O Romans, have often experienced yourselves in this very place. But how great do you think this good faith must have been towards your allies, when the enemies of all nations have placed implicit confidence in it? His humanity is such that it is difficult to say whether the enemy feared his valor more than fighting against him, or loved his mildness more when they had been conquered by him. And will anyone doubt that this important war ought to be entrusted to him, who seems to have been born by some a special design in favor of the gods for the express purpose of finishing all the wars which have existed in their own recollection. Well, so that's a very good example of the middle style. Now, finally, in the year 63 BC, the year of Cicero's consulship, an aged senator named Gaius Rabirius was indicted on a charge of high treason, which in Latin is called per duello, for actions that actually they allegedly occurred some 36 years earlier. The charge was really aimed at debilitating the authority of the Senate and consuls, and Cicero, now himself a consul and a staunch supporter of senatorial authority, spoke in Rabirius's defense. The introduction, or exordium, of the speech, marked by its serious and solemn tone, striking rhetorical figures, amplification, and stately periodic structure, presents a really good example of the grand style. And now let us read that together. Although, O Romans, it is not my custom at the beginning of a speech to give any reason why I am defending any particular defendant, because I have always considered that the mere fact of the danger of any citizen was quite sufficient reason for my considering myself connected with him. Still, in this instance, when I come forward to defend the life and character and all the fortunes of Gaius Rabirius, I think I ought to give a reason for my undertaking this duty, because the very same reason which has appeared to me a most adequate one to prompt me to undertake his defense ought also to appear to you sufficient to induce you to acquit him. For the ancientness of my friendship with him, and the dignity of the man, and a regard for humanity, and the uninterrupted practice of my life, have instigated me to defend Gaius Rabirius, and also the safety of the Republic, my duty as a consul, and the very fact of my being consul, since when I was made consul, the safety of the Republic, and also that of each individual citizen in it, was entrusted to me. All of this compelled me to do so with the greatest zeal. For it is not the actual offense, nor any desire to deprive Gaius Rabirius in particular of life, nor is it any old, well-grounded, serious enmity on the part of any citizen, which has brought him into this peril of his life. But the true design of this prosecution is that great aid which the majesty of the state and our dominion enjoys, and which has been handed down to us from our ancestors, may be banished from the Republic, that the authority of the Senate and the absolute power of the consul and the unanimity of all good men may henceforth be of no avail against any mischief or ruin designed to the state. And therefore, as a handle for the destruction of all these weighty obstacles, the old age and infirmity and solitary condition of one man is attacked. Wherefore, if it is the part of a virtuous consul, when he sees all the bulwarks of the Republic undermined and weakened, to come to the assistance of his country, to bring succor to the safety and fortunes of all men, to implore the good faith of the citizens, to think his own safety of secondary consideration when put in competition with the common safety of all, it is the part also of virtuous and fearless citizens, such as you have shown yourself in all the emergencies of the Republic, to block up all the avenues or sedition, to fortify the bulwarks of the state, to think that the supreme power is vested in the consuls, the supreme wisdom in the Senate, and to judge the man who acts in obedience to them worthy of praise and honor, rather than of condemnation and punishment. Wherefore, the labor in defending this man falls principally to my share. But the zeal for his preservation ought to be equally felt by me and by you. And as this is the case in the first place, as is most necessary to be done in such a contest for a man's life and reputation and all his fortunes, I entreat pardon and indulgence from the excellent and mighty Jupiter, and from all the other immortal gods and goddesses, by whose aid and protection this republic is governed, much more than by any reason or wisdom of man. And I pray of them to grant that this day may have dawned for the salvation of this man, and for the welfare of the Republic. And in the second place, I beg and entreat you, O Romans, you whose power comes nearest to the divine authority of the immortal gods, that since at one and the same time the life of Gaius Rabirius, a most unhappy and most innocent man, and the safety of the Republic is entrusted to your hands and to your votes, you will display that mercy as far as regards the fortunes of the individual, and that wisdom in what concerns the safety of the Republic, which you are accustomed to exercise. Now, we're still looking at those 5 different kind of activities of the orator, 5 different kind of parts of oratory. And now we're moving on to the 4th, memory. Speakers in our modern world can, of course, have recourse to written texts, computer screens, teleprompters, and all, to help them in the delivery of their speeches, and even in discourses of other kinds, debates and arguments, law cases. In such an environment, we tend to forget that the ancient orator depended almost exclusively upon memory when arguing a point or delivering a speech. Difficulty in manipulating ancient writing materials, the awkwardness of handling things like scrolls, and the expense of written materials and lack of indices, along with an absence of modern audiovisual electronic equipment, all made dependence on one's memory a absolute sine qua non of oratory in Cicero's day. Even though some of the stories about prodigious feats of memory from antiquity might be subject to hyperbole, it is certain that the ancients were called upon to use and exercise their memories to a much greater extent than we are. For example, a speaker of Cicero's ability and reputation could deliver a speech that lasted several hours, all from memory. Ancient theorists identified 2 types of memory, natural and artificial. Natural memory is that memory which is embedded in our minds and simultaneously occurs with our thoughts. Artificial memory is memory that comes from technique, that is memory that is strengthened by training and discipline. In that connection, an elaborate system of localities and images was developed for the purpose of enhancing artificial memory. In order to recall a series of facts or details, for instance, one would often choose a familiar location, for example, the houses on your street or the entrance into your home, and then link the things to be recalled with the series of localities and sequence. The system could be used for memorizing both words and content, and appears to have been extremely effective. Remarkably, such a system remains at the core of all modern memory systems today. There are courses you could take that that help to strengthen memory, and I actually even took one once, and one of the methods they taught was called the Cicero method, named after exactly this sort of thing of trying to memorize a long list of just random information based entirely upon things inside of one's house, connecting, say, the sink to, the first item, then the refrigerator to another item in your mind mentally. Despite our ready access to computers and teleprompters, the ability to deliver an argument or a speech from memory, recalling pertinent facts without reliance on other means, is an effective tool in oral communication and can certainly enhance any speaker's presentation. Cicero, in his De Oratore, relates the origin of this type of memory system and outlines the benefits that having a good memory offer a speaker. He says the following: I am grateful to the famous Simonides of Chios, who, as people say, first invented an art of memory. For they relate that when Simonides was at Cranon in Thessaly, at an entertainment given by Scopas, a man of rank and fortune, and had recited a poem which he had composed in his praise, in which, for the sake of embellishment, after the manner of the poets, there were many particulars introduced concerning Castor and Pollux. Scopas told Simonides with extraordinary meanness that he would pay him half the sum which he had agreed to give for the poem, and that he might ask the remainder, if he thought proper, from his Tyndaridai, to whom he had given an equal share of praise. A short time later, they say that a message was brought in to Simonides asking him to go out, as 2 youths were waiting at the gate who earnestly wished him to meet them with them. So he arose, went out, and found nobody. In the meantime, the hall in which Scopas was feasting fell down, and he himself and his company were overwhelmed and buried in the ruins. And when their friends wanted to inter their remains, but could not possibly distinguish one from another. So much crushed were the bodies. Simonides is said, from his recollection of the place in which each had sat, to have given sufficient directions for their burial. Prompted by this occurrence, he is reported to have discovered that it is chiefly order that gives strength to memory, and that those, therefore, who would improve this part of the understanding, certain places must be fixed upon, and that of the things which they desire to keep in memory. Symbols must be conceived in the mind, and ranged, as it were, in those places. Thus the order of the places would preserve the order of things, and the place and the symbols of the things would denote the things themselves, so that we should use the places as waxen tablets and the symbols as letters. How great the benefit of memory is to the orator, how great the advantage, how great the power. What need is there for me to observe? Why should I remark how excellent a thing it is to retain the instructions which you have received with the case, and the opinion which you have formed upon it? To keep all your thoughts upon it fixed in your mind, all your arrangement of language marked out there, to listen to him from whom you receive any information, or to him to whom you have to reply with such power of retention that they seem not to have poured their conversation into your ears, but to have engraved it on the tablet of your mind. They alone, accordingly, who have a vigorous memory, know what and how much and in what manner they are about to speak, and to what they have replied, and to what remains unanswered. And they also remember many courses that they have formerly adopted in other cases, and many which they have heard from others. I must, however, acknowledge that nature is the chief author of this qualification, as of all those of which I have previously spoken. But this whole art of oratory, or image and resemblance of an art, has the power not of begetting and producing anything entirely of itself, of which no part previously existed in our understandings, but of being able to give education and strength to what has already sprung to birth from there. Yet there is scarcely anyone so strong, anyone so strong with memory as to retain the order of his language and thoughts without a previous arrangement and observation of headings. Nor is anyone of so weak a memory as to receive assistance from this practice and exercise. For Simonides, or whoever else invented the art, wisely saw that those things are the most strongly fixed in our minds which are communicated to them and imprinted upon them by the senses. That of all the senses, that of seeing is the most acute, and that accordingly those things are most easily retained in our minds which we have received from the hearing or the understanding, if they are also recommended to the imagination by means of the mental eye, so that a kind of form, resemblance, and representation might denote invisible objects, and such as are in their nature withdrawn from the perception of sight, in such a manner that what we are scarcely capable of comprehending by thought, we may retain, as it were, by the aid of the visual faculty. By these imaginary forms and objects, as by all those that come under our physical vision, our memory is prompted and aroused. But some place for them must be imagined, as bodily shape cannot be conceived without a place for it. That I may not then be prolix and tedious upon so well known and common a subject, we must fancy many plain distinct places at moderate distances, and such symbols as are impressive, striking, and well marked, so that they may present themselves to the mind and act upon it with the greatest quickness. Practice, from which proceeds habit, will provide this faculty of artificial memory, as well as the derivation of similar words converted and altered in cases, or transferred from particulars to generals, and the idea of an entire sentence from the symbol of a single word, after the manner and method of any skillful painter who distinguishes spaces by the variety of what he depicts. But the memory of words, which, however, is less necessary for us, is to be distinguished by a greater variety of symbols. For there are many words which, like joints, connect the limbs of our speech, that cannot possibly be represented by anything similar to them. And for these we must invent symbols that we may invariably use. The memory of things is the proper business of the orator. This we may be enabled to impress on our memory by the creation of imaginary figures, aptly arranged to represent particular heads, so that we may recollect thoughts by images and their order by place. Nor is that true which is said by people unskilled in this artifice, that the memory is oppressed by the weight of these symbols, and they even obscure what unassisted nature might have clearly kept in view. For I have seen men of consummate abilities and on an almost divine faculty of memory, as Charmidas of Athens and Metrodorus of Skepsis in Asia, who is said to be still living, each of whom used to say that as he wrote with letters on wax, so he wrote with symbols, as it were, whatever he wished to remember, on these places which he had conceived in imagination. Though, therefore, a memory cannot be entirely formed by this practice, if there is none given by nature, yet certainly if there is a latent natural ability, it may be called forth. The next and last category of the 5 parts of oratory is delivery. We have all probably heard the old adage, it is not what you say, but how you say it. And we know from experience, listening to public speakers, be they politicians or priests in church or professors, that there is much truth in that statement. At times, this can be an unfortunate circumstance. For example, when a very good message with important content is obscured because of a terrible presentation. Or conversely, when poor content, or even false and misleading information, is made to sound appealing and overwhelmingly convincing because of an excellent manner of presentation. In any case, the importance of delivery, that 5th and final activity of the orator, was highly appreciated in antiquity, just as it is today. In fact, in order to illustrate its importance, Cicero was wont to relate a famous anecdote about the Greek orator Demosthenes. In his work, The Brutus, he said the following, and this bears out the truth of the saying attributed to Demosthenes, who, when asked what was the primary consideration in speaking, replied, delivery. What was the second? Delivery. And again, what was the third? Delivery. No other thing penetrates the mind more deeply, fashions, forms, and flexes it, and causes speakers to seem such persons as they themselves wish to seem. So just as location is a prime factor in real estate considerations, so is delivery in terms of argument and oratory. Theoretical discussions of delivery often divided the subject into 2 categories, voice and movement, with movement then further subdivided into gesture and facial expression. In the De Oratore, Cicero discusses voice, gesture, and facial expression, and links them closely to portraying the emotions desired by the speaker. In the following passage that we will quote, Crassus, the chief character of the dialogue, discusses these topics with the others and relates other interesting anecdotes about the delivery of skillful speakers. He says, but all these parts of oratory succeeded according to how they are delivered. Delivery, I say, has the sole and supreme power in oratory. Without it, a speaker of the highest mental capacity can be held in no esteem, while one of moderate abilities with this quality may surpass even those of the highest talent. To this, Demosthenes is said to have assigned the first place when he was asked what was the chief requirement in eloquence. To this, the second, and to this, the third. For this reason, I am inclined yet more to admire what was said by Aeschines, who, when he had left Athens on account of the disgrace of having lost his case and had gone to Rhodes, is reported to have read at the request of the Rhodians that excellent speech which he had delivered against Ctesiphon in opposition to Demosthenes. And when he had concluded it, he was asked on the next day to read that speech also, which had been published by Demosthenes on the other side in favor of Ctesiphon. And when he had read this too in a most pleasing and powerful tone of voice, and all expressed their admiration, how much more would you have admired it, said he, if you had heard him deliver it himself. By this remark, he sufficiently indicated how much depends on delivery, as he thought the same speech would appear different if the speaker had been changed. What was it in Gracchus, whom you, Catullus, remember better than me, that was so highly extolled when I was a boy. Whither shall I, unhappy wretch, betake myself? Whither shall I turn? To the capital? But that is drenched with the blood of my brother. Or to my home? That I may see my distressed and afflicted mother in all the agony of lamentation. These words, it was agreed, were uttered by him with such delivery as to countenance, voice, and gesture that his very enemies could not restrain their tears. I dwell the longer on these particulars because the orators, who are the deliverers of truth itself, have neglected this whole department, and the actors, who are the only imitators of truth, have taken possession of it. In everything, without doubt, reality has the advantage over imitation. And if reality were efficient enough to deliver of itself, in delivery of itself, we should certainly have no need for the aid of art. But as that emotion in the mind which ought to be chiefly expressed or imitated in delivery is often so confused as to be hidden and almost overwhelmed, the matters which throw that veil over it should be set aside, and the eminent and conspicuous aspects should be selected. For every emotion of the mind has from nature its own peculiar look, tone, and gesture, and the whole frame of a man, and his whole countenance, and the variations of his voice sound like strings in a musical instrument, just as they are moved by the affections of the mind. For the tones of the voice, like musical chords, are so wound up as to be responsive to each touch, sharp, flat, quick, slow, loud, gentle, and yet among all these, each in its kind has its own middle tone. From these tones, too, are derived many other sorts, as the rough, the smooth, the contracted, the broad, the protracted and interrupted, the broken and divided, the attenuated and inflated, with varieties and modulations. For there is none of these, or those that resemble them, which may not be influenced by art and management, and they are presented to the orator as colors to the painter to produce variety. Anger, for instance, assumes a particular tone of voice, acute, vehement, and with frequent breaks. But lamentation and bewailing assumes another tone, flexible, full, halting, and a kind of sorrow. Violence has another tone, intense, vehement, impetuous, with a kind of compelling excitement. Happiness has another, flowing, mild, tender, cheerful, languid. Trouble has another tone, a sort of gravity without lamentation, oppressed, as it were, with one heavy, uniform sound. All those emotions ought to be accompanied by a proper gesture, not the gesture of the stage, expressive of mere words, but one showing the whole force and meaning of a passage, not by gesticulation, but by emphatic delivery, by a strong and manly exertion of the lungs, not imitated from the theatre and the players, but rather from the camp and the palestra, which means the wrestling pit. The action of the hand should not be too affected, but following the words rather than, as it were, expressing them by mimicry. The arm should be considerably extended as one of the weapons of oratory. The stamping of the foot should be used only in the most vehement efforts at their commencement or conclusion. But all depends on the countenance, and even in that the eyes bear the chief sway. And therefore the oldest of our countrymen showed more judgment in not applauding even Roscius himself to any great degree when he performed in a mask. For all the powers of action proceed from the mind, and the countenance is the image of the mind, and the eyes are its interpreters. This, indeed, is the only part of the body that can effectually display an infinite number of expressions and changes, as there is of emotions in the soul. Nor can any speaker produce the same effect with his eyes shut as with them open. Theophrastus, indeed, has told us that a certain Tauriscus used to say that a player who pronounced his part gazing on any particular object was like one who turned his back on the audience. Great care in managing the eyes is therefore necessary, for the appearance of the features is not to be too much varied, lest we fall into some absurdity or distortion. It is the eyes, by whose intense and languid gaze, all as well as by their quick glances and gaiety, we indicate the workings of our mind with a particular attitude to the tenor of our discourse. For action is, as it were, the speech of the body, and ought therefore the more to accord with that of the soul. And nature has given eyes to us to declare our internal emotions, as she has bestowed a mane, tail, and ears on the horse and the lion. For these reasons, in our oratorical action, the countenance is next in power to the voice, and is influenced by the motion of the eyes. But in everything relating to action, there is a certain force bestowed by nature herself, and it is by action, accordingly, that the uneducated, the vulgar, and even barbarians themselves are principally moved. For words move none by those who participate in the same language. For words move none but those who participate in the same language, and clever thoughts often escape the understanding of ignorant men. But action, which by its own powers displays the movements of the soul, affects all mankind. For the minds of all men are excited by the same emotions, which they recognize in others and indicate in themselves by the same signs. The voice undoubtedly contributes most to effectiveness and excellence in delivery. The voice, I say, which in its full strength must be the chief object of our sources, of our wishes. And next, whatever strength of voice we have, to cherish it. On this point, how we are to assist the voice has nothing to do with precepts of the kind, though for my part I think that we should assist it to the utmost. But it seems fitting to the purport of my present remarks to observe, as I observed a little while ago, that in most things what is most useful, I know not how, the most becoming. For nothing is more useful for securing power of voice than the frequent variation of it. Nothing more pernicious than an immoderate straining of it without intermission. And what is more adapted to delight the ear and produce agreeableness of delivery than change, variety, and alteration of tone? Actually, the Gracchus whom I mentioned earlier acted accordingly. When he was addressing a public meeting, he used to have a skillful person with an ivory pitch pipe to stand concealed behind him, and who was in an instant to sound such a note as might either excite him from too languid a tone or recall him from one too elevated. There is in every voice, continued Crassus, a certain middle key, but that key is individual to each particular voice. For the voice to ascend gradually from this key is advantageous and pleasing, since to bawl at the beginning of a speech is boorish, and gradual change is salutary in strengthening the voice. There is also a certain extreme in the highest pitch, which, however, is lower than the shrillest cry, to which the pipe will not allow you to ascend, but will recall you from too strained an effort of voice. There is also, on the other hand, an extreme in the lowest notes, to which, as being of a full sound, we by degrees descend. This variety and this gradual progression of the voice throughout all the notes will preserve its powers and add agreeableness to delivery. But you may leave the piper at home and carry with you into the forum merely the intention of the custom. Now, having surveyed the 5 different parts of oratory, I now want to sort of move towards a conclusion with a couple of more general considerations. One of them is the value of imitation, as imitating good models of speaking. In antiquity, as today, the imitation of good models was considered an effective means of education. In fact, in Cicero's day, it was common for a young man to enter into a sort of apprenticeship called the Tyrocinium Fori, that is the kind of freshmanhood of the forum, or something like that, the kind of apprenticeship of the forum, during which he would be attached to a prominent citizen or statesman in order to observe his activity in the forum and in order to observe his activity in the courts. It was also important to choose good models in public speaking and to imitate their strengths while disregarding their weaknesses. Antonius, that other chief character in the De Oratore, expounds on the use of good models of effective persuasion as he gives advice to his young proteges Catullus and Sulpicius on this matter, and says the following: I like that method, replied Crassus, which you are accustomed to practice, namely, to put forward a case similar to those which are brought on in the forum, and to speak upon it as nearly as possible as if it were a real case. But in such efforts, the majority of students exercise only their voice, and not even that skillfully, and try their strength of lungs and volubility of tongue, and please themselves with a torrent of their own words. In which exercise what they have heard deceives them, that men by speaking succeed in becoming speakers. For it is truly said also that men by speaking badly make sure of becoming bad speakers. In those exercises, therefore, although it be useful even frequently to speak spontaneously, yet it is mere advantageous, after taking time to consider, to speak with greater preparation and accuracy. But the chief point of all is that which, to say the truth, we hardly ever practice, for it requires great labor, which most of us avoid. I mean to write as much as possible. Writing is said to be the best and most excellent modeler and teacher of oratory, and not without reason. For if what is mediated and considered easily surpasses sudden and extemporary speech, a constant and diligent habit of writing will surely be of more effect than mediation and consideration itself. Since all the arguments relating to the subject of which we write, whether they are suggested by art or by a certain power of genius and understanding, will present themselves and occur to us while we examine and contemplate it in the full light of our intellect. And all the thoughts and words which are the most expressive of their kind must of necessity come under and submit to the keenness of our judgment while writing. And a fair arrangement and collocation of words is effected by writing in a certain rhythm and measure, not poetical, but oratorical. Such are the qualities which bring applause and admiration to good orators. Nor will any man ever attain them, unless after long and great practice in writing, however resolutely he may have exercised himself in contemporary speeches. And he who comes to speak after practice in writing brings this advantage with him, that though he speak on the spur of the moment, yet what he says will bear a resemblance of something written. And if ever, when he comes to speak, he brings anything with him in writing, the rest of his speech, when he departs from what is written, will flow on in a certain strain. As when a boat has once been impelled forward, though the rowers suspend their efforts, the vessel herself still keeps her motion and course during the intermission of the impulse and force of the oars. So in a continued stream of oratory, when written matter fails, the rest of the speech maintains a similar flow, being impelled by the resemblance and force acquired from what was written. But in my daily exercises, I used, when a youth, to adopt chiefly that method which I knew that Gaius Carbo, my adversary, generally practiced, which was that, having selected some stirring piece of poetry, or read over such a portion of a speech as I could retain in my memory, I used to declaim upon what I had been reading in other words, chosen with all the judgment that I possessed. But at length I perceived that in that method there was this inconvenience, that Ennius, an early epic poet in Latin, if I exercised myself on his verses, or Gracchus, if I laid one of his orations before me, had forestalled such words as were peculiarly appropriate to the subject, and such as were the most elegant and altogether the best, so that if I used the same words, it profited nothing. If others, it was even prejudicial to me, as I accustomed myself to use such as were less eligible. Afterwards, I thought it proper, and continued the practice at another more advanced age, to translate the speeches of the best Greek orators, by fixing upon which I gained this advantage, that while I rendered into Latin what I had read in Greek, I not only used the best words, and yet such as were of common occurrence, but also formed some words by imitation, which would be new to our countrymen, taking care, however, that they were unobjectionable. And now, in this final section, I would like to talk about the value of writing to prepare for effective speaking. The importance of learning to write clearly and cogently is well recognized in educational circles even today. Increasing numbers, too, are acknowledging the importance of effective verbal communication as an important skill to be imparted to our young people entering the world. The link between good speaking and good writing, while not readily apparent to some, was clearly evident to Cicero. As he mentioned in this section just now, effective written composition entails, and as we talked about earlier, effective written composition entails the activities of invention, arrangement, and style, the first three of the five activities of the orator, and as such serve as a model exercise and training for effective speaking. And we will just conclude our last section of Cicero from the De Oratore about this very topic. I like that method, replied Crassus, which you are accustomed to practice, namely to put as we look back on the on all of these selections that I have provided for you in this lecture, and we consider the activities of the speaker and rhetorical precepts offered in the typical rhetorical handbooks of Cicero's day, we realize that we have encountered only the proverbial tip of the iceberg. A full accounting of all the rules for persuasion could fill many hours of this kind of format. Moreover, according to Cicero, the precepts for persuasion contained in the typical handbooks are only a small part of what goes into creating a real speaker, one who possesses the genuine power and ability to persuade his listeners. The challenge of speaking effectively in public is a monumental one, and to do so with effectiveness and success requires not only mere knowledge of the precepts of the art of rhetoric, a considerable amount of inborn talent and diligent practice, but also a capacious knowledge, broad and deep, of those subjects that we still know today as the liberal arts. It is fitting to conclude then this survey of Ciceronian persuasion, where Cicero himself begins in the preface to his De Oratore, addressed to his brother Quintus, where he speaks at some length about the difficulty of becoming a great speaker, and he outlines what he considers the requisites of the ideal orator, the exploration of which he then pursues in the subsequent pages of his great masterpiece. And as he readily concedes, few people are up to such demands, but knowledge of the art, application of our intellects, and a broad education will help all of us to become more effective speakers who know how to convince people and how to win an argument. He says this: often indeed as I review in thought the greatest of mankind and those endowed with the highest abilities, it has appeared to me worthy of inquiry what was the cause that a greater number of persons have been admirable in every other pursuit than in speaking. For whatever way you direct your view and thought and contemplation, you will see numbers excellent in every type, not only of the humble, but even of the highest arts. Who indeed is there that, if he would measure the qualifications of illustrious men, either by the usefulness or magnitude of their actions, would not prefer a general to an orator? Yet who doubts that we can produce from this city alone almost innumerable excellent commanders, while we can number scarcely a few eminent in speaking? There have been many also in our own memory, and more in that of our fathers, and even of our forefathers, who had abilities to rule and govern affairs of state by their counsel and wisdom, while for a long period no tolerable orators were found, or scarcely one in every age. But lest anyone should think that the art of speaking may more justly be compared with other pursuits, which depend upon abstruse studies and a varied field of learning, than with the merits of a general or the wisdom of a prudent senator, let him turn his thoughts to those particular sciences themselves, and contemplate who and how many have flourished in them, as he will thus be best enabled to judge how great a scarcity of orators there is and has ever been. It does not escape your observation that what the Greeks call philosophy is esteemed by the most learned men, the originator, as it were, and parent of all the arts which merit praise. Philosophy, I say, in which it is difficult to enumerate How many distinguished men have there been, and of how great knowledge, variety, and comprehensiveness in their studies, men who have not confined their labors to one province separately, but have embraced whatever they could master either by scientific investigations or by processes of reasoning. Who is ignorant of how great obscurity of matter, in how abstruse, manifold, and subtle an art they who are called mathematicians are engaged? Yet in that pursuit so many men have arrived at excellence that not one seems to have applied himself to the science in earnest without attaining in it whatever he desired. Who has ever devoted himself wholly to music? Who has ever given himself up to the learning which they profess, who are called grammarians, without grasping in knowledge and understanding the whole substance and matter of those sciences, though almost boundless? Of all those who have engaged in the most liberal pursuits and departments of such sciences, I think I may truly say that a smaller number of eminent poets have arisen than of men distinguished in any other branch of literature. And in the whole multitude of the learned, among whom there rarely appears one of the highest excellence, there will be found, if you will but make a careful review of our list and that of the Greeks, far fewer good orators than poets. This ought to seem the more wonderful, as attainments in other sciences are drawn from obscure and hidden springs. But the whole art of speaking lies before us, and is concerned with common usage and the custom and language of all men. So that while in other things that is most excellent, which is most remote from the knowledge and understanding of the illiterate, it is in speaking even the greatest of faults to vary from the ordinary kind of language and the practice sanctioned by universal reason. Yet it cannot be said with truth either that more are devoted to the other arts, or that they are excited by greater pleasure, more abundant hope, or more ample rewards. For to say nothing of Greece, which was always desirous to hold the first place in eloquence, and Athens, that inventress of all literature, in which the utmost power of oratory was both discovered and brought to perfection. In this very city of ours, assuredly, no studies were ever pursued with more earnestness than those tending to the acquisition of eloquence. For when our empire over all nations was established, and after a period of peace had secured tranquility, there was scarcely a youth ambitious of praise who did not think that he must strive with all his endeavors to attain the art of speaking. For a time, indeed, as being ignorant of all method, and as thinking there was no course of exercise for them, or any precepts of art, they attained what they could by the single force of genius and thought. But afterwards, having heard the Greek orators and gained an acquaintance with Greek literature and procured instructors, our countrymen were inflamed with an incredible passion for eloquence. The magnitude, the variety, the multitude of all kind of cases excited them to such a degree that to that learning which each had acquired by his individual study, frequent practice, which was superior to the precepts of all masters, was at once added. There were then, as there were also now, the highest inducements offered for the cultivation of this study in regard to public favor, wealth, and dignity. The abilities of our countrymen, as we may judge from many particulars, far excelled those of the men of every other nation, for which reasons who would not justly wonder that in the records of all ages, times, and states, so small a number of orators should be found? But the art of eloquence is something greater, and collected from more sciences and studies than people imagine. For who can suppose that amid the greatest multitude of students, the utmost abundance of masters, the most eminent geniuses among men, the infinite variety of cases, the most ample rewards offered to eloquence, there is any other reason to be found for the small number of orators than the incredible magnitude and difficulty of the art? A knowledge of a vast number of things is necessary, without which volubility of words is empty and ridiculous. Speech itself is to be formed, not merely by choice, but by careful construction of words, and all the emotions of the mind, which nature has given to man, must be intimately known, for all the force and art of speaking must be employed in allaying or exciting the feelings of those who listen. To this must be added a certain portion of grace and wit, learning worthy of a well-bred man, and quickness and brevity in replying, as well as attacking, accompanied with a refined decorum and urbanity. Besides, the whole of antiquity and a multitude of examples is to be kept in the memory, nor is the knowledge of laws in general or of civil law in particular to be neglected. And why need I add any remarks on delivery itself, which is to be ordered by action of body, by gesture, by look, and by modulation and variation of the voice, the great power of which alone and in itself the comparatively trivial art of actors and the stage proves, on which, though all bestow their utmost labor to form their look, voice, and gesture, who knows not how few there are, and have ever been, to whom we can attend with patience. What can I say of that repository for all things, the memory, which, unless it be made the keeper of the matter, and the words that are the fruits of thought and invention, all the talents of the orator we see, though they be of the highest degree of excellence, will be of no avail? Let us then cease to wonder what is the cause of the scarcity of good speakers, since eloquence results from all those qualifications, in each of which singly it is a great merit to labor successfully. And let us rather exhort our children and others whose glory and honor is dear to us, to contemplate in their minds the full magnitude of the object, and not to trust that they can reach the height at which they aim, by the aid of the precepts, masters, and exercises that they are all now following, but to understand that they must adopt others of a different character. In my opinion, indeed, no man can be an orator possessed of every praiseworthy accomplishment, unless he has attained the knowledge of everything important, and of all liberal arts, for his language must be ornate and copious from knowledge, since unless there be beneath the surface matter understood and felt by the speaker, oratory becomes an empty and almost puerile flow of words. And there, my friends, is perhaps one of the most eloquent and beautiful and profound articulations, really, of the whole ideal of the classical educational model, now in its Roman guise, but still very much the same enterprise, just slightly adapted to the political and kind of cultural realities of Rome. That to be a good speaker is to be a perfectly educated person, to be able to have on hand a whole storehouse of broad knowledge of law, of literature, of philosophy, of history, of current events, of politics, and to be able to argue cases, to deduce things rationally, to look at evidence and see the right course of action, to make plans about the future. It's all there. It's all there. This is what a classical education is meant to provide, that formation of character, to be a well-read person, an urbane person, a person with sophistication who takes pleasure in the good, filled with decorum, and yet not without grace and wit and liveliness. It's all there, and this is what we're after in the classical model of education. Okay, my friends, very good, and I will see you all next time. Thank you.